Some discoveries refuse to stay in the past. They surface without warning, challenging everything we think we know about ancient civilizations. Across deserts, deep oceans, and buried cities, archaeologists have uncovered objects and structures that defy explanation. Too precise, too advanced, out of place in time. What if history is missing entire chapters we were never meant to see? From sealed chambers untouched for millennia to artifacts that shouldn't exist, these findings raise more questions than answers. Tonight, we explore 3 hours of unexplained ancient archaeological discoveries ever recorded. Step closer. What you're seeing may change how you see history itself. At the edge of the Jezreel Valley in northern Israel, a low, unassuming mound rises from the landscape. It is Tel Megiddo, an archaeological site layered with thousands of years of human history, buried one civilization atop another. From a distance, it appears almost ordinary, but beneath its surface lies a place that has witnessed the rise and fall of kingdoms, the clash of empires, and the quiet disappearance of entire worlds. Megiddo is mentioned in ancient records as far back as the 3rd millennium BC, a strategic city controlling vital trade routes linking Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the broader Levant. Archaeologists have uncovered more than 20 distinct layers of settlement here, each one a frozen chapter of human ambition and collapse. Massive fortifications, monumental gates, and complex water systems reveal a city engineered for survival in an age of constant conflict. Yet what makes Megiddo particularly compelling is not only what is known, but what remains uncertain. Among the most striking discoveries is an advanced underground water system carved deep into the bedrock. A spiraling tunnel descends tens of meters below the surface, designed to allow access to a spring outside the city walls without exposing inhabitants to attack. Its engineering precision raises questions about the level of technical knowledge available at the time of its construction. How did ancient builders coordinate such a feat without modern tools? And what prompted such a sophisticated solution in an era often assumed to be technologically limited? Then there are the monumental gates, massive stone structures once attributed to the reign of Solomon. For decades, their scale was used as evidence of a powerful centralized kingdom in the 10th century BC. However, later excavations and revised dating techniques sparked debate among scholars, suggesting the possibility of different timelines or multiple phases of construction. The discussion remains open, reflecting the broader tension in archaeology between textual tradition and material evidence. But Megiddo's intrigue extends beyond architecture. The site has yielded unusual artifacts, figurines, cultic objects, and ritual spaces that hint at complex religious practices. Some chambers appear to have been deliberately sealed, their contents left untouched for millennia. Were these acts of preservation, abandonment, or something less understood? The absence of clear answers leaves room for interpretation, and in that space, speculation naturally emerges. Certain fringe interpretations have even suggested Megiddo as a focal point of symbolic or prophetic significance, shaped not only by its history, but by its repeated association with decisive battles. The term Armageddon itself is derived from Har Megiddo, Mount Megiddo, evoking images of final confrontations and world-changing events. While mainstream scholarship treats this as linguistic and historical evolution, the symbolic weight of the site continues to inspire broader, sometimes speculative readings. Yet archaeology resists easy conclusions. Each excavation season adds detail but rarely closure. New layers complicate older narratives. What once seemed definitive is revised, reinterpreted, or challenged by fresh evidence. Standing at Megiddo today, it is difficult not to sense the accumulation of time beneath the soil. Cities built, destroyed, and rebuilt again, each unaware of the full story they were becoming part of. The stones do not speak directly, but they suggest patterns, interruptions, and mysteries that resist full resolution. And so the question remains, Is Megiddo simply a remarkably well-documented ancient city, or does it still conceal chapters of history that have yet to be fully understood beneath its silent, layered earth? From the layered ruins of Megiddo, where cities rise and fall beneath centuries of dust, the investigation moves outward across the Mediterranean world. Far from the fortified hills of the Levant, another place emerges from history with a different kind of silence. Not a battlefield buried under stone and ash, but an island shaped by myth, devotion, and abandonment. Delos lies at the heart of the Aegean Sea, a small, rocky island once considered one of the most sacred places in the ancient Greek world. Today, it is uninhabited. Wind moves freely through its ruins, and the sound of the sea replaces the voices that once filled its streets. Yet, in antiquity, Delos was anything but empty. It was a thriving religious and commercial center, said in Greek tradition to be the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, figures associated with light, purity, and divine order. For centuries, pilgrims arrived by ship, stepping onto an island that was believed to be set apart from ordinary land. No one was allowed to be born or die here, according to later tradition, in an effort to preserve its sacred purity. Whether strictly enforced or symbolically remembered, this idea shaped Delos as a place suspended between life and ritual, between the human and the divine. Walking through its ruins today, one encounters the remains of sanctuaries that once defined this sacred identity. Temples dedicated to Apollo stand in partial reconstruction, their columns aligned with precision that still reflects classical Greek architectural mastery. Nearby, the Terrace of the Lions presents one of the island's most iconic features. Rows of marble lions carved by the people of Naxos around the 7th century BC, originally standing guard along a ceremonial path. Their silent gaze now faces an empty avenue, exposed to centuries of wind and salt. But Delos is not only a story of devotion, it is also a story of sudden transformation. In the 2nd century BC, after shifting political control in the Aegean, Delos was declared a free port under Roman influence. What followed was an extraordinary period of economic expansion. Merchants, traders, and craftsmen from across the Mediterranean arrived, turning the island into a dense and cosmopolitan hub. Warehouses, marketplaces, and elaborate private homes were constructed at remarkable speed. The architecture of sacred simplicity gave way to the complexity of commerce. Yet beneath this prosperity lies an unresolved tension. Archaeological layers suggest rapid cycles of construction and abandonment, as if the island's identity shifted too quickly for stability to take hold. Some districts appear carefully planned, while others feel abruptly altered, as though external forces interrupted long-term development. What drove such rapid transitions? And how did a place defined by sacred permanence become one of the busiest commercial centers in the ancient world? Among the residential ruins, the so-called House of the Dolphins and House of Dionysus reveal intricate mosaics and wall decorations depicting mythological scenes. These homes suggest immense wealth, but also a curious imbalance, luxury existing alongside fragmentation, beauty alongside decay. Some scholars interpret this as evidence of social stratification in a rapidly growing port. Others point to the possibility of repeated waves of occupation and clearance, leaving behind a patchwork of interrupted lives. Then there are the sanctuaries themselves. The Temple of Isis introduces an unexpected layer to Delos's religious landscape. Egyptian deities worshipped alongside Greek gods point to a remarkable fusion of spiritual traditions. Statues, inscriptions, and ritual objects found here suggest that Delos was not only a Greek sanctuary, but a crossroads of belief systems. How did these traditions coexist? Were they harmonized through shared ritual practice, or layered one upon another without true integration? Even more enigmatic are the remains of smaller, less understood shrines scattered across the island. Some structures do not align neatly with known architectural patterns. Others contain unusual deposits of offerings, objects placed with care but lacking clear symbolic explanation. These findings have led to differing interpretations. Mainstream archaeology frames them as expressions of evolving religious syncretism in a multicultural port. More speculative perspectives have suggested that Delos functioned as a broader symbolic center, where overlapping belief systems converged in ways that are not yet fully understood. Then, in 88 BC, the island's trajectory shifted dramatically. During the Mithridatic Wars, Delos was attacked and heavily damaged. Its population was dispersed, and its commercial dominance declined rapidly. By the time of later Roman consolidation, the island never fully recovered its former prominence. What remained was a landscape of partial abandonment, structures left behind, sacred spaces exposed, and streets slowly reclaimed by time. But abandonment does not always mean silence in historical interpretation. Some researchers point to the abruptness of Delos's decline as unusual, suggesting that economic and political factors alone may not fully explain the scale of its depopulation. Others emphasize environmental changes, shifting trade routes, or the deliberate relocation of religious authority elsewhere in the Aegean. Each explanation carries weight, yet none fully resolves the complexity of the archaeological record. Today, Delos stands as a preserved contradiction. It is both meticulously documented and fundamentally incomplete. Its stones preserve the outline of a sacred city, yet its meaning feels partially dispersed, as though some aspect of its lived reality has not survived the passage of time. And so the question remains, as the wind moves through empty courtyards and broken columns, was Delos simply a sacred island that rose and fell with the tides of ancient history, or does its layered silence still conceal a deeper story that has yet to be fully uncovered? From the silent terraces of Delos, where sanctuaries once echoed with prayers carried across the Aegean, the narrative drifts away from the sea and turns inward toward another cradle of ancient memory. The Mediterranean fades into desert heat and river mist, and the story follows an older current of civilization drawn south and east to the banks of the Nile. Here, in Upper Egypt, the landscape changes again. The river moves slowly through a narrow green corridor, bordered by vast stretches of sand and stone. And along this edge of life and desert lies Abydos, one of the most ancient and symbolically charged burial grounds in the ancient world. At first glance, Abydos does not reveal itself easily. The ruins are scattered, partially restored, partially consumed by time. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies a necropolis that stretches back to the earliest dynasties of Egypt, long before the construction of the Great Pyramids. For thousands of years, it was a place reserved for kings, elites, and sacred ritual, an intersection between death, kingship, and divine legitimacy. Archaeological evidence shows that Abydos was already significant by the First Dynasty, around 3000 BC. Early rulers such as Narmer and Jer were buried here, their tombs forming part of a vast royal cemetery known today as el-Ka'ab. These are not simple graves, but complex structures of mud brick and stone, surrounded by subsidiary burials that suggest ritual practices still not fully understood. Some chambers were sealed with extraordinary care, as if preserving something more than just physical remains. Yet even after more than a century of excavation, Abydos continues to resist complete understanding. One of its most striking features is the so-called lost tombs, a term often used to describe the many royal and elite burials that are known from historical records, but have never been conclusively identified in the archaeological record. Egypt's early dynastic period is partially reconstructed through king lists carved in later temples, yet not all names correspond neatly to discovered tombs. This gap between text and material evidence creates a quiet but persistent mystery. Where are the missing burials of these early rulers? At el-Ka'ab, the ground itself becomes a layered archive. Tombs overlap, corridors intersect, and later intrusions disturb earlier structures. Looting in antiquity further complicates the picture, leaving behind empty chambers, broken seals, and scattered fragments of funerary goods. What remains is not a complete narrative, but a fragmented map of power, belief, and ritual continuity. And then there is the question of intention. Some tombs appear carefully constructed with symbolic alignment and ritual precision. Others seem abruptly modified, expanded, or partially abandoned. In certain cases, archaeologists have found evidence that later rulers attempted to associate themselves with earlier kings by building adjacent monuments or restoring older sacred spaces. Was this an act of reverence, political legitimacy, or an attempt to physically anchor authority within sacred geography? Just north of the main burial fields stands another structure that deepens the enigma, the Osirian. Built in the style of a symbolic tomb for the god Osiris, it lies partially below ground, surrounded by massive stone pillars and a central water channel. Its construction does not align neatly with conventional temple design of its period. Some scholars suggest it was intended as a cenotaph, a ritual representation of the underworld. Others argue it reflects a more complex layering of religious symbolism, where myth and architecture merge into a single conceptual space. Why was such a structure built in this specific location? And why does it appear to stand slightly apart from the architectural language of nearby monuments? Nearby, the Temple of Seti I adds another layer to the story. Its finely carved reliefs depict kings engaging with deities, presenting a carefully constructed narrative of divine kingship. On one of its walls, the famous Abydos King List preserves the names of many pharaohs in chronological order. Yet notably, certain rulers are absent, omitted for reasons that remain debated. Was this selective history, political revision, or a theological decision about who was considered legitimate in the eternal record of kings? Outside the temple complex, archaeologists have also uncovered evidence of ritual boat burials, wooden vessels placed deliberately in pits, intended perhaps for use in the afterlife journey of a king. These boats, preserved in fragments, suggest a belief system in which movement beyond death required carefully prepared vessels, echoing the riverine world of the living Nile. But not all discoveries fit neatly into established interpretations. Some structures and deposits in Abydos appear unusually arranged or contextually ambiguous. Objects placed in isolation, chambers sealed without clear explanation, and architectural alignments that invite multiple readings. While mainstream archaeology interprets these as variations in evolving funerary practice, others have speculated, more cautiously, that Abydos may have held multiple overlapping functions over time, blending burial, ritual performance, and dynastic memory in ways that are not yet fully reconstructed. Still, these interpretations remain secondary to the overwhelming weight of established evidence. Abydos was fundamentally a royal necropolis and sacred center, shaped by centuries of cultural development along the Nile. And yet, even within that framework, gaps remain. The absence of certain tombs, the incomplete alignment between written king lists and discovered burials, and the architectural anomalies scattered across the site all suggest that the full story of Abydos is still unfolding beneath the desert surface. Standing amid its ruins today, with wind moving across half-buried stones and the distant outline of temples rising from sand, one is left with a sense of continuity interrupted rather than completed. A place where memory was carefully constructed, but never fully preserved. And so the question lingers in the quiet heat of the Egyptian desert. How many of Abydos' royal dead have truly been found, and how many still rest unseen beneath the shifting sands, waiting for history to catch up with what was once believed to be already known? From the royal necropolis of Abydos, where kings were laid to rest beneath layers of ritual memory and shifting sand, the journey moves away from the Nile's quiet endurance and toward a harsher landscape. A land of stone and silence, of cliffs and deep desert wind. Here, High above the Dead Sea Rift rises a solitary plateau of rock, isolated from the surrounding desert by sheer cliffs on every side. This is Masada. At first approach, it appears almost unreachable. A natural fortress shaped by geological time, its summit stretches long and flat, as if deliberately carved for occupation. From below, the cliffs rise like walls of a forgotten world. From above, the horizon opens in all directions, revealing the vast emptiness of the Judean desert. It is both strategic and symbolic, a place where geography itself becomes defense. Masada's history is most famously tied to the final chapter of the First Jewish-Roman War in the 1st century A.D. According to the accounts of the historian Josephus, it was here that Jewish rebels known as the Sicarii made their last stand against the Roman Empire. When Roman forces finally breached the defenses after a prolonged siege, they reportedly found the fortress silent, its defenders having chosen death over capture. This account has shaped Masada's place in historical memory for centuries. Yet the site itself tells a more layered story. Archaeological excavations have revealed that Masada was not simply a wartime stronghold, but a complex and carefully developed center that underwent multiple phases of construction. The most significant expansion is attributed to Herod the Great in the late 1st century BC, who transformed the natural plateau into a heavily fortified palace complex. Storerooms, bathhouses, administrative buildings, and defensive walls were constructed with remarkable precision, reflecting both Roman engineering influence and local adaptation. Water management at Masada is particularly striking. In a region defined by extreme aridity, an intricate system of cisterns was carved into the rock, capable of collecting and storing large quantities of seasonal rainwater. Channels and aqueducts directed runoff into these reservoirs, allowing the fortress to sustain itself even under prolonged isolation. How did ancient engineers calculate such systems with such accuracy in such a hostile environment? And how long could a place like this truly survive without external supply? At the northern edge of the plateau stands the most elaborate of Herod's constructions, the Northern Palace. Built in 3 descending terraces along the cliff face, it appears to defy the natural limits of the terrain. Retaining walls anchor it into the rock, while decorative elements suggest a level of luxury that contrasts sharply with its defensive purpose. It is at once a palace and a fortress, a place of power suspended above the desert. Yet Masada is not defined only by its architecture. It is also defined by its silence. Unlike many ancient sites, there are relatively few inscriptions, personal artifacts, or direct traces of daily life preserved in abundance. This absence has fueled long-standing debate among archaeologists. Is this simply the result of time, erosion, and looting? Or does it reflect a more complex reality, one in which the site was rapidly abandoned, repurposed, or selectively cleared in its final moments? The most controversial aspect of Masada's story remains the question of what truly happened during its last days. Josephus's narrative describes a collective decision by the defenders to end their own lives rather than be taken captive. However, archaeological evidence provides only indirect support for this account. Human remains are scarce, and material traces are open to interpretation. Some scholars argue that the dramatic literary framing may reflect ideological or rhetorical motives rather than precise historical reporting. This gap between narrative and material evidence has led to ongoing discussion. Was Masada's final chapter exactly as described, or has history preserved only a structured memory of events shaped by later interpretation? Beyond the historical debate lies the broader question of Masada's role within the regional landscape. Its position suggests not only military significance, but also symbolic power. Visible from vast distances, the fortress commands the desert visually, as much as strategically. Some interpretations emphasize its role as a Herodian statement of authority, an assertion of control over both environment and perception. Others have explored more speculative readings of the site's function across time. Could Masada have served multiple overlapping roles beyond what is recorded? Military, administrative, ceremonial, shifting identity as political circumstances changed? The architectural complexity allows for such questions, even if definitive answers remain elusive. In certain areas of the site, particularly around storage rooms and peripheral structures, archaeologists have identified phases of reuse and modification that do not always align neatly with known historical events. Walls were reinforced, spaces subdivided, and functions altered. These changes suggest a living site, continuously adapted rather than statically preserved. And yet, despite extensive excavation, Masada still feels incomplete in its narrative. The stone remains, the walls stand, and the cisterns still echo with the memory of water. But the human dimension remains partially obscured, filtered through both historical texts and archaeological interpretation. Even the desert itself contributes to the mystery. Wind moves constantly across the plateau, reshaping sand, exposing and concealing fragments over time. What lies just beneath the surface continues to shift, reminding us that archaeology here is not a final state, but an ongoing negotiation with the landscape. And so Masada remains suspended between certainty and interpretation. A fortress defined as much by what is known as by what cannot be fully reconstructed. A place where history, memory, and landscape overlap without fully resolving into a single narrative. And as the desert stretches endlessly in every direction, one question quietly persists in the silence of the plateau. How much of Masada's story has truly been recovered, and how much still rests unseen within the stone? From the wind-scoured heights of Masada, where stone still holds the echo of isolation and defiance, the narrative now moves away from the desert plateau and across the sea. The silence of the Judean cliffs gives way to salt air, shifting currents, and a coastline that once stood at the center of an ancient maritime world. Here, along the shores of North Africa, near modern-day Tunis, lie the remains of one of antiquity's greatest cities, Carthage. At first glance, the archaeological landscape appears fragmented. Low ruins scattered across hills, reconstructed foundations rising from layers of soil and stone. Yet beneath this quiet surface lies a city that once commanded the Western Mediterranean. A civilization built not only on land, but on sea routes that stretched across continents. Founded in the 9th century BC according to tradition, Carthage emerged as a Phoenician colony that grew into an independent maritime power. Its strategic position allowed it to dominate trade between the eastern and western Mediterranean, controlling routes that connected North Africa, Iberia, Sicily, and beyond. From this coastal vantage point, Carthage became a center of commerce, shipbuilding, and political influence, its identity shaped as much by the sea as by the land beneath it. But the city's story is also defined by absence. Much of what is known about Carthage comes from later Roman accounts, written after its destruction in 146 BC at the end of the Third Punic War. According to historical tradition, Roman forces besieged the city for years before finally breaching its defenses, leading to its systematic destruction. The city was burned, its political structures dismantled, and its population dispersed or enslaved. Roman writers later described the site as emptied of its former identity, its legacy overwritten by conquest. Yet archaeology reveals a more complex picture. Excavations on Bursa Hill and the surrounding harbor zones have uncovered multiple layers of occupation, suggesting not a single moment of destruction, but a gradual transformation. Beneath Roman-era construction lie Punic foundations, streets, residential blocks, and industrial areas that speak of a densely organized urban environment. The city was not only powerful, but intricately structured, with advanced urban planning that included drainage systems, harbors, and specialized districts for trade and craft production. One of the most remarkable features of Carthage is its harbor complex, often referred to as the Kothon. This engineered port system consisted of two interconnected basins, a rectangular commercial harbor and a circular naval harbor, designed to house a powerful fleet. At the center of the naval basin, an island structure once held administrative and military functions, allowing commanders to oversee ship movements with precision. The scale and geometry of this harbor continue to raise questions about the level of coordination and technical knowledge required to construct such a system in the ancient world. How did Carthaginian engineers design and maintain such an advanced maritime facility without the tools and technologies of later eras? And how did this infrastructure support a city whose influence extended across half the Mediterranean? Beyond its urban core, Carthage also reveals spaces that remain more difficult to interpret. One such site is the Tophet, an area containing urns and stelae that has generated extensive scholarly debate. Archaeological evidence confirms that it functioned as a ritual burial ground for infants and animals, often associated with votive offerings. Classical sources, particularly Roman writers, described practices that have been interpreted as child sacrifice, though modern scholarship remains divided on the extent and interpretation of these accounts. Some researchers argue that the Tophet reflects a cemetery for children who died prematurely, later given symbolic dedication. Others suggest it may have held multiple layers of ritual significance that evolved over time. The ambiguity of the Tophet illustrates a broader challenge in understanding Carthage. Much of its cultural identity is filtered through external perspectives, particularly those of its political rivals. This creates a tension between archaeological evidence and historical narrative. What was Carthage as experienced by its own inhabitants, independent of the way it was later described? Even the city's destruction carries layers of uncertainty. Roman accounts famously describe the complete leveling of Carthage and, in later retellings, even the sowing of salt across its ruins to ensure it would never rise again. Yet historical evidence for such a ritual act remains uncertain and is widely debated among historians. What is clear, however, is that Rome established a new city on or near the same site shortly afterward, transforming the landscape once again. Urban continuity replaced total erasure, suggesting that even destruction was followed by adaptation. Still, beneath Roman Carthage lie traces of the earlier city that have not been fully revealed. Excavations continue to uncover domestic spaces, inscriptions, and artifacts that challenge simplified narratives of rise and fall. Some areas remain only partially explored, buried beneath later development or inaccessible due to urban expansion. The full extent of Punic Carthage may never be completely recovered, and so the city exists today as a layered palimpsest: Phoenician foundations, Punic streets, Roman reconstruction, and modern settlement all overlapping in the same space, each layer partially visible, none entirely complete. This stratification raises quiet questions. How much of Carthage's original urban fabric still lies beneath the modern landscape, untouched and unrecorded? What aspects of its daily life, its political structures, its religious practices remain buried beyond the reach of excavation? Even its silence is not uniform. Some areas yield abundant artifacts, while others remain strangely empty, as if deliberately cleared or never fully occupied. These patterns invite interpretation, but resist definitive explanation. And so Carthage remains suspended between memory and reconstruction. A city once said to rule the sea, now partially hidden beneath earth and time, its identity reconstructed through fragments and inference. Standing on its hills today, overlooking the Mediterranean horizon, one final question emerges, not as conclusion, but as continuation. How much of Carthage has truly been recovered, and how much of its story still lies beneath the ground, waiting for history to speak again? From the layered ruins of Carthage, where empires once rose from the Mediterranean shore and were later rewritten by conquest, the journey shifts once again across continents and oceans. The salt air fades, replaced by thin mountain air. The coastline dissolves into vast distance, and the narrative turns inland, across the spine of South America. Here, in the sacred valley of the Andes, the landscape narrows into a dramatic corridor of river, cliffs, and peaks. Towering above it all lies Ollantaytambo. At first sight, the site appears divided between two worlds. On one side, a living Inca town still follows the ancient grid of stone streets and water channels. On the other, rising steeply above it, immense terraces climb the mountainside like a frozen staircase carved into the earth itself. And across the valley, on a separate ridge, stand massive stone walls and unfinished structures that seem suspended in time. Ollantaytambo is widely recognized as both a ceremonial center and a military stronghold of the Inca Empire during the 15th century AD. It played a key role in the Inca resistance against Spanish forces during the early stages of the conquest. Yet even this well-documented history does not fully explain the complexity of what remains on the ground. The most striking feature is not only the scale of the terraces, but the precision of the stonework found in the upper temple complex. Gigantic blocks of pink andesite, some weighing dozens of tons, are fitted together with a level of accuracy that leaves almost no space between joints. These stones were transported from quarries located across the Urubamba River and up steep slopes, an undertaking that would require immense coordination, engineering skill, and labor organization. How were such massive stones moved across such terrain without wheels, iron tools, or draft animals capable of carrying such weight? And why were they brought specifically to this elevated ridge, overlooking the valley below? At the top of the terraces stands what is often referred to as the Temple of the Sun, a structure composed of 6 monumental monoliths aligned in a precise formation. Some of these stones appear partially finished, as if the construction process was interrupted. Tool marks remain visible, but their purpose and method are still debated. Were they left incomplete due to sudden historical disruption, or do they represent a construction technique that remains only partially understood today? The precision of the stone fitting has led mainstream archaeology to attribute the work to highly advanced Inca masonry techniques, developed over generations. Yet the sheer scale of certain elements continues to invite broader questions about logistical capability and planning. The Inca had no written language in the conventional sense, yet their architectural achievements reflect a deep understanding of geometry, terrain, and structural stability. And then there are the stones themselves. Some blocks at Ollantaytambo display angles and cuts that conform precisely to the irregular shapes of neighboring stones, forming interlocking patterns that resist seismic movement. In a region prone to earthquakes, this design is not only aesthetic but functional. It suggests an intimate knowledge of environmental conditions and adaptive engineering practices that were refined over time. But across the site, not everything aligns neatly with known patterns. Certain wall segments appear abruptly terminated. Others seem to incorporate stones that do not match the surrounding construction style, as if different phases or methods were layered together. At first glance, this can be explained by long-term development, renovation, and adaptation under changing rulers. Yet the visual impression is one of discontinuity, of a site built, modified, and partially abandoned in ways that are not fully linear. Across from the main terraces, on a distant hillside, lies a structure often referred to as the unfinished wall. Massive stone blocks are embedded into the cliff face, some carved but never fully integrated into a complete structure. The purpose of this construction remains uncertain. Was it intended as part of a larger ceremonial complex, a defensive extension, or something that was never completed due to historical interruption? Nearby, carved niches and drainage channels suggest ritual or functional usage, but their exact relationship to the larger complex is still debated. Water management, as in many Andean sites, plays a crucial role here. Channels carefully guide mountain runoff through terraces and into the valley below, preventing erosion while sustaining agriculture. This integration of engineering and landscape is one of the defining features of Inca architecture. Yet even this functional brilliance does not fully resolve the broader questions surrounding the site's construction sequence. Some researchers propose that Ollantaytambo was built in phases spanning generations, with different rulers expanding and modifying earlier foundations. Others suggest that certain elements may preserve older traditions of stoneworking that predate the Inca expansion in this region. These interpretations remain speculative, but continue to be part of academic discussion. Then there is the broader symbolic dimension. The alignment of terraces, temples, and surrounding peaks suggests intentional integration with the natural landscape. Mountains in Andean cosmology were not merely geological formations, but living entities, often revered as protective spirits. In this context, Ollantaytambo may have functioned not only as a fortress or agricultural center, but as a place where human construction and natural geography were deliberately intertwined. Still, symbolism does not fully explain the practical challenges of construction. The logistics of quarrying, transporting, and precisely placing multi-ton stones across steep terrain remain a subject of study and debate. Modern experiments have demonstrated possible methods using ropes, ramps, and coordinated labor, yet the full efficiency of the original process is still not entirely reconstructed. And so Ollantaytambo stands as a convergence of clarity and uncertainty, a place where the strength of established historical understanding meets the limits of what can be physically and fully recreated. Walking through its narrow stone passages today, where water still runs through ancient channels and sunlight falls across weathered walls, it is difficult not to sense both mastery and mystery coexisting in the same space. A civilization deeply attuned to its environment, yet still partially unreadable in its most ambitious expressions. And as the mountains rise around it in quiet permanence, one question remains suspended in the thin Andean air. How much of Ollantaytambo's true construction story has been preserved in stone, and how much still lies hidden in the silence between its walls? From the stone terraces of Ollantaytambo, where mountains and human engineering seem to merge into a single language of carved rock, the journey now turns away from the Andes. The air shifts again. High-altitude silence gives way to the scent of salt and earth carried across a different continent. The narrative moves eastward, across oceans and time, toward one of archaeology's most enduring questions. A place where myth and excavation have never fully settled into the same story. Here, in northwestern Turkey, near the modern village of Hisarlik, the ground rises subtly above the surrounding plain. It is not a dramatic peak, nor a naturally imposing formation. And yet beneath this modest hill lies something extraordinary, the layered remains of an ancient city known to history as Troy. At first glance, the site appears almost understated. Low excavation trenches cut through earth and stone, revealing fragments of walls, gates, and foundations. But beneath this quiet surface lies a complexity built over millennia, multiple cities stacked upon one another, each rebuilt after destruction, each preserving traces of a different era of human settlement. Archaeologists have identified at least 9 major layers of Troy, often labeled Troy I through Troy IX, spanning from the early Bronze Age to the Roman period. Each layer represents not just continuity, but rupture, cycles of growth, conflict, collapse, and renewal. The result is a site that does not tell a single story, but many overlapping ones, partially visible and partially lost. Troy's earliest layers date back to around the 3rd millennium BC, when it was a fortified settlement controlling access between the Aegean and the Black Sea regions. Its location made it strategically significant, a point of convergence for trade routes linking Anatolia, the Balkans, and beyond. Even in its earliest forms, Troy was not isolated. It was connected, influenced, and contested. Yet it is Troy 7a, dating to roughly the 13th century BC, that draws the most attention. This is the layer often associated with the legendary Trojan War described in Homer's Iliad, a narrative of siege, conflict, and the fall of a great city after years of struggle. But archaeology and epic poetry do not always align neatly. Excavations in Troy 7a reveal signs of destruction, burned structures, hastily constructed defenses, and evidence of sudden abandonment. Some buildings appear to have been damaged by fire, while others show indications of seismic disturbance or structural collapse. Human remains and arrowheads have been found in certain areas, suggesting violence, though the scale and nature of the conflict remain open to interpretation. Was this the historical foundation of the Trojan War, or one of many conflicts that occurred in a strategically contested region over centuries? Mainstream scholarship tends to view the Iliad as a poetic synthesis of multiple oral traditions, possibly inspired by real conflicts that took place in late Bronze Age Anatolia. In this reading, Troy may have experienced repeated episodes of warfare involving regional powers such as the Mycenaeans and the Hittite Empire, rather than a single, definitive siege as described in myth. Yet even within this framework, uncertainties remain. One of the central mysteries is the identity of the city's attackers and defenders. Written records from neighboring civilizations mention a place called Wilusa, often associated by scholars with Ilion, another name for Troy. Hittite texts describe political tensions and shifting alliances in the region, suggesting that Troy existed within a broader geopolitical landscape of competing powers. But the exact nature of these interactions remains only partially understood. Then there is the question of scale. The Troy described in later literary tradition appears vast, wealthy, and heavily fortified. Yet the archaeological remains of Troy 7a, while significant, do not fully match the grandeur of epic description. This gap between narrative magnitude and material evidence has fueled ongoing debate. Was the city's importance amplified through centuries of storytelling, or have parts of its physical structure simply not yet been uncovered? Beyond Troy 7a lies another layer, Troy 6, which shows signs of impressive architectural development, massive walls, sloping defenses, and carefully constructed gates. Some scholars once associated this layer with Homeric Troy, due to its sophistication and apparent prosperity. However, evidence of earthquake damage in this layer has led others to suggest that natural disaster, rather than warfare, may have played a significant role in its destruction. So, which layer, if any, corresponds to the Troy of legend? The answer remains uncertain. Adding further complexity are the centuries of excavation history itself. In the late 19th century, Heinrich Schliemann famously excavated the site, driven by the belief that Homer's epics preserved a historical memory of real events. His work revealed multiple layers of settlement, but his methods, while groundbreaking for their time, also resulted in the loss of contextual information. In his eagerness to identify Priam's treasure, Schliemann may have disturbed earlier layers in ways that modern archaeology continues to reassess. Later excavations refined the chronology, introducing more careful stratigraphic analysis and revealing the full depth of Troy's long occupation history. Each new phase of research has added clarity, but also further nuance to the site's interpretation. And yet, even with modern techniques, Troy resists full resolution. Certain areas remain difficult to interpret. Architectural fragments suggest periods of rapid rebuilding. Storage vessels and domestic remains indicate shifts in population density. Some layers appear abruptly interrupted, as if development was cut short or redirected. These patterns can be explained through cycles of war, trade disruption, or environmental stress. But none of these explanations fully capture the complexity of the transitions observed. And then there is the enduring pull of narrative itself. The story of Troy, as preserved in literature, has shaped cultural imagination for millennia. A city besieged for 10 years, a war sparked by mythic causes, a wooden horse entering the gates. These images have become inseparable from the name itself. Yet archaeology reveals a more fragmented reality. Multiple cities, multiple destructions, and a long history of human occupation that extends far beyond a single moment in time. Some interpretations suggest that the myth of Troy may preserve a collective memory of repeated conflicts in the region, compressed into a single epic framework over generations. Others propose that the legend served symbolic or cultural functions, rather than strict historical documentation. Still others continue to search for closer correspondences between specific archaeological layers and the narrative of the Iliad. But no single interpretation has fully resolved the relationship between myth and material record. Today, standing above the excavated ruins, the landscape appears deceptively quiet. Grass grows over ancient walls. Wind moves through trenches that reveal only partial outlines of what once stood here. The city is both present and absent at once, visible in fragments, yet never fully reconstructible in its entirety. And so Troy remains suspended between story and soil, between poetic memory and archaeological evidence. A place where history is not a fixed narrative, but an ongoing investigation shaped by each new discovery. As the sun sets over the plain of Hisarlik, casting long shadows across layered stone and earth, one question continues to linger in the silence. How much of Troy has truly been recovered, and how much of its story still lies buried beneath the shifting ground between myth and history? From the windswept plains of Troy, where layers of myth and archaeology still overlap in quiet uncertainty, the journey turns once again toward the south and east, crossing seas and deserts, returning to the land where one of the world's earliest civilizations shaped its vision of eternity. The narrative settles in Egypt. Here, on the western edge of the Nile, the desert rises in a pale, silent plateau. At first glance, it appears empty, an endless stretch of sand and stone. But beneath this surface lies one of the most extensive burial landscapes ever created by ancient hands, Saqqara. Stretching for miles, Saqqara served as the necropolis for the ancient city of Memphis, Egypt's first capital. For more than 3,000 years, it remained an active burial ground, evolving continuously from the earliest dynasties through the later periods of pharaonic rule. Kings, nobles, priests, and artisans were laid to rest here, each generation adding new layers to an already ancient landscape. And yet, despite centuries of excavation, Saqqara is still not fully known. It is a place that continues to reveal itself slowly, chamber by chamber, shaft by shaft, each discovery suggesting that much more remains hidden beneath the desert floor. The most famous monument here is the Step Pyramid of Djoser, constructed around the 27th century BC. It is often considered the earliest large-scale stone building in history. Designed by the architect Imhotep, it rises in tiers, as if stone itself is learning how to become architecture for the first time. Surrounding it are courtyards, ceremonial spaces, and subterranean tunnels that extend deep into the bedrock. But the pyramid is only the visible beginning. Beneath Saqqara lies an intricate network of underground structures, tombs, shafts, galleries, and sealed chambers that extend far beyond what was originally expected. Some have been mapped, others only partially explored, and some are known only through anomalies detected beneath the sand. One of the most remarkable discoveries in recent years is the so-called Saqqara Cache of Coffins, a burial complex containing dozens of sealed wooden sarcophagi, many still untouched after more than 2 millennia. The vivid colors and inscriptions remain astonishingly preserved, depicting protective spells, divine figures, and passages meant to guide the dead through the afterlife. Yet even this discovery hints at something larger. Archaeologists have identified deep vertical shafts nearby, some descending more than 30 meters into the limestone bedrock. At the bottom of these shafts, additional chambers have been found, often sealed in ways that suggest deliberate concealment. Why were these spaces placed so deep beneath the surface? And why were they so carefully hidden from later disturbance? Saqqara is not a single construction. It is a layered system of belief, evolving continuously over thousands of years. Each dynasty added its own architectural language to the landscape, resulting in a necropolis that is both unified and fragmented, structured, yet endlessly complex. Among its most intriguing features are the Serapeum tunnels, a vast underground complex originally built to house the mummified remains of sacred Apis bulls. These massive stone sarcophagi, some weighing over 70 tons, are carved from single blocks of granite and placed deep within long, narrow corridors. The precision of their construction is striking, not only in their scale but in the consistency of their finish. How were such enormous containers transported through confined underground passages? And what level of planning was required to coordinate such work beneath the surface of the desert? The Serapeum raises questions not only about engineering, but about ritual intention. The Apis bull was considered a living manifestation of divine power, and its burial was treated with extraordinary reverence. Each interment followed strict ceremonial procedures, suggesting a deeply structured belief system that extended into the architecture itself. Yet Saqqara is not defined only by what has been understood. In recent decades, ground-penetrating surveys have revealed anomalies beneath areas that have not yet been fully excavated. These voids suggest the presence of additional chambers or corridors, still sealed and untouched. Some appear large enough to suggest tomb complexes or ceremonial halls. Others are smaller, more isolated, their purpose entirely unknown. What lies within these spaces remains a matter of anticipation rather than certainty. Mainstream archaeology approaches these findings cautiously, emphasizing that Saqqara's long history makes it likely that many structures remain buried simply due to the sheer scale of the necropolis. Over millennia, sand accumulation, later construction, and natural collapse have concealed vast portions of the site. But the imagination naturally extends beyond what is confirmed. Some researchers have speculated that Saqqara may contain undiscovered royal tombs from early dynasties, possibly lost due to incomplete historical records or shifts in burial practices. Others suggest that certain deep structures may have served ritual functions that have not yet been fully interpreted within modern frameworks. There are even questions about whether Saqqara's underground complexity was fully visible to all who lived during its active use. Did ancient Egyptians themselves understand the full extent of what was being built beneath them over centuries? Or did the necropolis evolve in layers so gradual and continuous that its total scale was never fully comprehended in any single moment? The desert itself plays an active role in this uncertainty. Wind reshapes dunes, sand conceals and reveals. Structures thought to be fully excavated sometimes yield new passages after shifting conditions or renewed investigation. Saqqara is not a static archive. It is a changing environment where visibility itself is temporary. Even the relationship between the living and the dead here is not entirely fixed. Temples and offering chapels indicate ongoing rituals performed long after initial burials. This suggests that Saqqara was not simply a city of the dead, but a place of continuing interaction between worlds, a landscape where memory was actively maintained rather than passively preserved. And yet, despite all of this knowledge, the site resists completion. Each excavation season brings clarity to one area while raising new questions in another. A tomb revealed in full may suggest the existence of others nearby. A newly mapped shaft may connect to an unseen network beyond current excavation boundaries. The deeper researchers go, the more the necropolis expands conceptually, if not always physically. It is this tension between what is seen and what is still hidden that defines Saqqara today. A place thoroughly studied, yet still incomplete. Carefully mapped, yet still expanding in implication. Known, yet not fully known. And so the question remains, lingering beneath the desert's surface like the chambers themselves waiting in silence. How many more structures lie beneath Saqqara's shifting sands? And what aspects of Egypt's earliest funerary landscape are still waiting, untouched, in the darkness below? From the deep shafts and hidden chambers of Saqqara, where the desert conceals entire worlds beneath layers of sand and silence, the journey shifts once more. The Nile fades into memory. The monumental stone of dynastic Egypt gives way to something older in a different sense, not grander in scale, but more intimate, more immediate, and perhaps even more enigmatic in its simplicity. The narrative moves northward, across the Levantine corridors and into the highlands of Anatolia. Here, in the rolling plains of central Turkey, the landscape appears unremarkable at first glance. Wheat fields stretch across gentle rises, and modern life passes overhead with little indication of what lies beneath. But beneath one of these modest hills rests a site that has quietly transformed our understanding of early human settlement. Çatalhöyük. At first, there is no visible monument, no towering walls, no grand temples or royal inscriptions. Instead, there is earth, layered, compacted, and carefully excavated over decades to reveal something unexpected. A dense, tightly packed settlement dating back to approximately 7,500 BC. Çatalhöyük is not a city in the traditional sense. There are no streets separating buildings. Instead, houses are built directly against one another, forming a continuous mass of interconnected dwellings. Entry was not through doors at ground level, but through roofs. Ladders led down into domestic spaces from above, suggesting a way of life structured vertically rather than horizontally. From above, the settlement may have resembled a vast, continuous surface, rooftops functioning as pathways, courtyards, and shared communal space. But what kind of society builds its entire existence upon rooftops? And what does it mean to live without streets in the conventional sense of separation and distance? Excavations at Çatalhöyük have revealed a remarkably detailed record of daily life. Walls decorated with geometric patterns, animal motifs, and what appear to be symbolic or ritual imagery. In some rooms, plastered surfaces show repeated applications, as if spaces were continuously renewed, layered over time in a way that merges architecture with memory. Burial practices add another dimension to the site's complexity. Many individuals were buried beneath house floors, often directly beneath living spaces. The dead were not separated from the living in distant cemeteries, but placed within the domestic sphere itself. Some skeletons show signs of careful positioning, occasionally accompanied by grave goods, suggesting ritual significance attached to both death and household continuity. Yet despite decades of study, the meaning behind many of these practices remains open to interpretation. One of the most discussed features of Çatalhöyük is the presence of what have been interpreted as symbolic figurines, including female forms often associated with fertility or earth-based symbolism. Some scholars interpret these artifacts as evidence of ritual or religious practices centered around nature, life cycles, and domestic continuity. Others caution against projecting later cultural frameworks onto objects whose meanings may have been entirely different within their original context. Then there are the wall paintings. In several excavated rooms, murals depict scenes that appear to show animals, geometric forms, and what some have interpreted as possible representations of environmental events. One widely discussed image appears to show a volcanic eruption in the distance, possibly associated with the nearby Hassan Dağ volcano. If this interpretation is correct, it may represent one of the earliest known visual records of a natural disaster. But even this reading is not universally agreed upon, and alternative interpretations suggest symbolic or abstract meanings rather than literal depiction. What then were these images meant to represent? Memory? Observation? Ritual expression? Or something that does not neatly align with modern categories of meaning at all? The absence of clear, centralized structures at Çatalhöyük adds further complexity. Unlike later urban centers, there is no evidence of palaces, administrative buildings, or distinct elite zones. Houses appear relatively uniform in size and construction, suggesting a level of social organization that does not conform easily to later hierarchical models. Some researchers interpret this as evidence of a more egalitarian society, while others propose that hierarchy may have existed in forms that are not easily visible in the archaeological record. And yet, even this interpretation is not definitive. The very structure of Çatalhöyük raises questions about how space, identity, and community were experienced. Without streets, without visible public squares, how did people gather? How were decisions made? How was collective identity maintained in such a tightly packed environment? The rooftops may have served as the primary social space, places of movement, gathering, and exchange. But even this remains partially inferred, reconstructed from architectural patterns rather than direct evidence. Beneath the domestic layers, archaeologists have identified repeated cycles of construction, abandonment, and rebuilding. Houses were often rebuilt in the same location, sometimes directly over earlier structures. This suggests a deep continuity of place, where physical space accumulated meaning over generations. Walls became layered records of human activity, memory embedded into mud brick and plaster. But continuity does not always mean stability. Certain phases of Çatalhöyük show signs of abrupt change, shifts in building patterns, variations in burial practices, subtle alterations in symbolic imagery. These changes may reflect environmental pressures, population shifts, or evolving cultural practices. Yet the precise drivers of these transitions remain debated. And then there is the question of why the settlement was eventually abandoned. By around 5700 BC, Çatalhöyük was no longer inhabited. The reasons remain uncertain. Environmental change, resource depletion, or social transformation have all been proposed. But no single explanation fully accounts for the complexity of the archaeological record. What remains is a site preserved not in a moment of destruction, but in a long process of gradual departure. Houses sealed, spaces left unused, life slowly withdrawing from a place that had been continuously inhabited for centuries. Today, Çatalhöyük appears quiet beneath excavation grids and protective coverings. Yet beneath the surface, its structures still hold traces of daily life. Ash deposits from hearths, impressions of tools, fragments of painted plaster, and the remains of those who lived and died within its walls. It is a city without streets, without monuments, without written records, and yet it speaks in a language of material continuity that is still being interpreted. And so the question remains, suspended above the layered rooftops of this ancient settlement. Was Çatalhöyük an early experiment in urban life that followed a path unlike any later civilization, or does its unusual structure reflect forms of social organization and meaning that modern archaeology is only beginning to understand? From the layered rooftops of Çatalhöyük, where entire communities once lived above their own history, moving across ceilings instead of streets, the journey shifts again. The silence of Anatolia gives way to distance, carried eastward along ancient corridors of trade and migration. The narrative follows those routes not only through geography, but through time itself, into the foothills of the northwest Indian subcontinent. Here, in present-day Pakistan, near the banks of the ancient Kabul River, lies Taxila. At first glance, the landscape appears calm, framed by rolling hills and modern settlements. Yet beneath this quiet exterior rests one of the most historically complex urban regions of antiquity. Taxila was not a single city, but a succession of cities, built, expanded, destroyed, and rebuilt over centuries. Each layer reflects a different cultural influence, forming a rare convergence point where empires, philosophies, and trade networks intersected. Archaeological evidence places the earliest settlements in the Taxila region as far back as the 6th century BC. Over time, it became a major center of learning, commerce, and cultural exchange. Persian influence arrived first, followed by Alexander the Great's campaign in the 4th century BC, and later the Indo-Greek, Kushan, and other regional powers. Each left traces not only in material culture, but in urban planning, architecture, and intellectual traditions. But Taxila is not defined by empire alone. It is often described in ancient sources as a center of learning, an early intellectual hub where scholars, monks, and students gathered to study philosophy, medicine, grammar, and astronomy. Some traditions even describe it as hosting one of the earliest organized systems of higher education in the ancient world. While the exact structure of such institutions remains debated, archaeological remains suggest a city deeply engaged in knowledge production and exchange. Yet even this widely accepted narrative leaves questions unresolved. Excavations across Taxila's multiple sites, Sirkap, Sirsuk, and Dharmarajika, among others, reveal a striking diversity of architectural styles. Greek-influenced city grids appear alongside Buddhist stupas and Persian-inspired fortifications. Streets are laid out with geometric precision in some layers, while others reflect more organic, adaptive growth. This layering of urban design suggests not only cultural transition, but coexistence of different planning philosophies over time. How did these systems interact? Were they successive impositions by changing rulers, or did they overlap within a shared urban environment where multiple traditions coexisted simultaneously? At Sirkap in particular, the grid-like city plan attributed to Indo-Greek influence stands out. Streets intersect at right angles, forming blocks reminiscent of Hellenistic urban design. Within these blocks, temples, residential structures, and commercial spaces coexist in a tightly organized layout. This suggests a period in which Greek administrative and architectural ideas were integrated into local contexts, producing a hybrid urban form. But beneath this apparent order lies a more complex archaeological reality. Certain structures appear to have been modified multiple times, with walls rebuilt over earlier foundations and building materials reused across different periods. This suggests that Taxila was not simply replaced by successive civilizations, but continuously reshaped by them. The city becomes less a static entity and more a living palimpsest, an evolving urban organism responding to shifting political and cultural forces. Then there is Sirsuk, the later Kushan-era city, enclosed by massive defensive walls. Unlike earlier settlements, Sirsuk appears more heavily fortified, suggesting a shift toward increased militarization or concern for external threats. Its construction reflects a different architectural philosophy, more rigid, more centralized, and more defensive in orientation. Yet even here, the pattern is not straightforward. Some areas of Sirsuk show signs of incomplete construction or later abandonment, raising questions about the stability of its occupation. Was this city fully realized, or was its development interrupted by political or environmental changes that remain only partially understood? Beyond urban structures, Taxila's most enduring legacy may lie in its religious and philosophical significance. The region is closely associated with early Buddhist traditions, and numerous stupas and monasteries have been uncovered across the site. The Dharmarajika stupa, for example, stands as one of the earliest major Buddhist monuments in the region, believed to enshrine relics associated with the Buddha himself. Monastic complexes surrounding these stupas suggest a highly organized religious environment, with spaces dedicated to meditation, teaching, and communal living. Yet even within these structures, variations in design and layout suggest gradual adaptation rather than uniform construction. Some monasteries appear modest and functional, while others are more elaborate, incorporating decorative elements and complex spatial arrangements. What determined these differences? Were they based on doctrinal distinctions, patronage, or evolving monastic practices over time? Then there are the artifacts. Coins, inscriptions, sculptures, and pottery fragments recovered from Taxila reveal a remarkable diversity of cultural influence. Greek inscriptions appear alongside Brahmi and Kharosthi scripts. Hellenistic artistic motifs coexist with Buddhist iconography. This blending of visual and linguistic systems suggests a level of cultural interaction that is still not fully understood in its depth or mechanism. How did communication function in such a multilingual and multicultural environment? Was there a dominant administrative language, or did translation and adaptation form the basis of daily governance and trade? Some scholars interpret Taxila as one of the earliest examples of true cosmopolitan urbanism in South Asia, a place where multiple traditions not only met, but actively shaped one another. Others caution that this interpretation may oversimplify the complex hierarchies and power dynamics that likely existed within the city over time. And then there is the question of continuity. Taxila does not present a single moment of collapse. Instead, it shows a gradual shifting of importance, with different areas rising and declining in prominence over centuries. Eventually, by the early medieval period, its role as a major urban and intellectual center diminished. The reasons are not fully clear. Changes in trade routes, political realignments, and regional transformations likely all played a part. But no single factor fully explains the gradual fading of a city that once stood at the crossroads of empires. Today, the ruins of Taxila lie scattered across a broad landscape, partially excavated and partially still buried beneath soil and time. Temples, monasteries, and urban foundations emerge in fragments, each offering insight into a different layer of its history. Yet no single excavation captures the full extent of what Taxila once was. It is a city known through accumulation rather than completion. And so Taxila remains suspended between clarity and obscurity, a place where knowledge itself was once cultivated, yet where the full story of its own transformation remains only partially revealed. As the narrative continues across continents and centuries, one question lingers within the layered soil of this ancient region. How much of Taxila's true identity has been uncovered, and how much still lies hidden beneath the overlapping histories of the civilizations that once called it home? From the preserved silence of Joya de Carène, where an entire village was sealed in ash and time like a forgotten memory, the narrative moves once more across continents. The humid jungles of Central America fade into coastal winds and open sea routes, carrying the story back toward the eastern Mediterranean. Here, on the rugged southern coast of present-day Turkey, limestone cliffs rise sharply above the turquoise waters of the ancient Lycian shoreline. Carved into these cliffs, like echoes etched directly into stone, are hundreds of rock-cut tombs. This is Myra. At first glance, the cliffs appear almost decorative, as if nature itself had been sculpted into architecture. But upon closer inspection, the rock face reveals something far more deliberate. Doorways, columns, pediments, and facades, each carved directly into the living rock, form an entire necropolis suspended above the valley floor. The tombs of Myra are among the most visually striking burial monuments of the ancient world. Dating primarily to the 4th century BC, they belong to the Lycian civilization, a culture that developed its own distinct architectural and funerary traditions while interacting with Greek and Persian influences over centuries. Yet despite their visual familiarity in archaeological photography and historical documentation, the deeper questions surrounding Myra's tombs remain only partially resolved. These are not simple graves. They are elaborate architectural imitations of wooden houses, temples, and civic structures, transposed into stone and permanently embedded into cliffs. The facades are often richly decorated, with columns, reliefs, and symbolic motifs suggesting status, identity, and belief systems tied to the afterlife. But why build tombs in this way? Mainstream interpretations suggest that the Lycian elite sought to replicate the houses of the living in stone, ensuring continuity between earthly existence and the world beyond death. The elevated placement of the tombs is often understood as symbolic, bringing the dead closer to the sky, the divine or ancestral realms. And yet, even within this explanation, certain features resist simple interpretation. Some tombs appear unfinished, their carvings abruptly halted mid-structure, as if construction was interrupted or abandoned. Others are densely clustered in ways that suggest evolving spatial organization over time, rather than a single unified plan. In certain cases, tomb facades overlap or intersect visually, creating the impression of layered burial phases embedded into the same cliff face. Was this the result of long-term reuse of sacred space, or does it reflect changing funerary practices that adapted continuously across generations? Below the cliffside necropolis lies the ancient city of Myra itself, once a significant urban center of Lycia. Archaeological remains indicate theaters, civic buildings, and temples that reflect the city's integration into broader Greco-Roman cultural networks, especially after its incorporation into the Roman Empire. But while the city below has been partially excavated and understood, the tombs above remain more enigmatic, not in their existence, but in their meaning. One of the most debated aspects of the Myra necropolis is the relationship between tomb architecture and social identity. Some tombs are highly elaborate, suggesting elite ownership, while others are simpler, yet still carved with careful attention to form. This variation raises questions about how social hierarchy was expressed in death. Was burial architecture strictly tied to wealth and status, or did certain symbolic conventions override economic distinctions, allowing different groups to participate in shared funerary traditions? In several tombs, inscriptions have been found in the Lycian language, later supplemented by Greek inscriptions during periods of Hellenization. These bilingual and sometimes layered inscriptions suggest a complex cultural environment in which identity was not fixed but negotiated over time. Yet the full Lycian language remains only partially understood, and many inscriptions are fragmentary or eroded. As a result, some tomb dedications cannot be fully translated, leaving gaps in the intended meaning of the monuments themselves. What messages were meant to be preserved in stone, but now remain unreadable? Beyond language, there are structural questions that continue to intrigue researchers. The precision of cliff carving at Myra implies advanced planning and sustained labor. The rock face itself is not uniform. It varies in hardness, fractures, and stability. Yet the tomb facades maintain consistent architectural proportions despite these natural irregularities. This suggests careful adaptation to geological conditions, an integration of engineering and artistry that required intimate knowledge of the cliff's composition. How were these decisions made without modern surveying tools? And how was structural stability ensured in a vertical environment prone to erosion and seismic activity? Some tombs appear to incorporate natural fissures in the rock as part of their design, while others avoid them entirely. This selective integration of geology into architecture raises questions about whether the cliffs were perceived not merely as building surfaces, but as active participants in the funerary landscape. Then there is the question of visibility. Unlike buried necropolies, the tombs of Myra are deliberately exposed, positioned high above the valley where they would have been visible from land and possibly from the sea. This suggests that the necropolis was not only a place of burial, but also a form of public display, a landscape of memory intended to be seen, acknowledged, and perhaps even interpreted by those passing below. But visibility also introduces vulnerability. Over centuries, the tombs have been affected by erosion, seismic activity, and human intervention. Some have collapsed entirely. Others have been repurposed in later periods, including Byzantine modifications and occasional reuse as shelters or storage spaces. This layered history of reuse complicates attempts to reconstruct the original funerary landscape. What we see today is not a static necropolis, but a continuously transformed one. And yet, even in their altered state, the tombs retain a sense of deliberate presence. They remain anchored in the cliff face, as if resisting complete disappearance. There are also broader questions about how Myra's necropolis fits within Lycian cultural identity. Lycian tomb architecture is found throughout the region, often following similar cliffside patterns. This suggests a shared funerary tradition across multiple settlements, yet each site also displays local variation. Was there a centralized cultural or religious framework guiding these practices, or were they the result of regional interpretations of shared beliefs about death and the afterlife? And what role did external influences, Greek, Persian, Roman, play in shaping or reshaping these traditions over time? Even within Roman period Myra, continuity and adaptation appear side by side. Some tombs were reused or reinterpreted, while others remained untouched, frozen in their earlier Lycian form. This coexistence of preservation and transformation adds another layer of complexity to the site's long history. Today, the cliffs of Myra stand as both monument and archive. Wind moves through carved chambers. Shadows shift across stone facades that once marked transitions between life and death. The necropolis is no longer active, yet it continues to communicate through form rather than language. And perhaps that is where its mystery endures most strongly, not in what is missing, but in what remains visible without ever fully revealing its original meaning. As the narrative moves forward from these carved cliffs, one final question lingers in the stone silence above the valley. How much of Myra's funerary language has been understood, and how much of its meaning still rests encoded within the rock, waiting to be read again by time? From the silent cliffs of Myra, where ancient tombs still gaze out across valleys like carved memories suspended in stone, the narrative shifts once more across continents and oceans. The Mediterranean light fades. The air grows heavier, humid, alive with the sound of water and jungle. The journey now moves into Southeast Asia, where the scale of ancient architecture expands beyond individual monuments into entire landscapes of sacred geometry. Here, in present-day Cambodia, the forest does not simply surround history, it contains it. Angkor. At first encounter, the jungle appears dominant. Trees rise in tangled layers, roots wrapping around stone like slow-moving hands reclaiming forgotten ground. Vines descend over walls that once formed part of one of the largest urban and religious complexes ever constructed in the pre-industrial world. And yet, beneath this green canopy, the outlines of temples, causeways, reservoirs, and entire cities still remain. Angkor is not a single site. It is a vast archaeological landscape, an interconnected system of capitals, temples, hydraulic infrastructure, and ceremonial spaces that developed over centuries, primarily between the 9th and 15th centuries A.D. under the Khmer Empire. At its heart stands Angkor Wat, often regarded as the largest religious monument in the world. Built in the early 12th century, it was originally dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, before gradually transitioning into a Buddhist site. Its towers rise in a carefully arranged quincunx pattern, symbolizing Mount Meru, the mythological center of the universe in Hindu cosmology. But Angkor Wat is only the most visible expression of a far more complex system. Beyond its outer walls lie corridors of bas-reliefs stretching for hundreds of meters, depicting battles, celestial realms, and scenes of daily life. These carvings are not static decorations. They are narrative surfaces, encoding historical memory, mythological structure, and political ideology into stone. And yet, even here, interpretation is not always straightforward. Some scenes depict events that align with known historical conflicts of the Khmer Empire. Others present mythological episodes whose symbolic meaning remains open to interpretation. The blending of historical and mythological representation creates a layered visual language that does not easily separate fact from cosmology. What then were these reliefs meant to preserve? History? Belief? Or something that existed between the two? Moving outward from Angkor Wat, the landscape expands into a network of temples that once formed the core of a sprawling urban civilization. Angkor Thom, Ta Prohm, Preah Khan, Banteay Shrey. Each site reflects a different moment in Khmer architectural and spiritual development. At Angkor Thom, massive stone faces gaze outward from towers at the Bayon Temple. Their expressions are calm, unreadable, and multiplied across the structure in all directions. Scholars generally associate these faces with either King Jayavarman VII or with Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, or perhaps a synthesis of both royal and divine identity. But their presence raises deeper questions. Why multiply a face so many times across a sacred structure? Was it an expression of divine kingship, a symbolic projection of omnipresence, or a representation of a worldview in which human authority and spiritual power were inseparable? At Ta Prohm, nature and architecture exist in a fragile equilibrium. Massive tree roots wrap around collapsed galleries and doorways, creating the impression that the temple is being slowly absorbed rather than simply abandoned. Unlike other sites that have been extensively restored, Ta Prohm has been deliberately left in a partially overgrown state, preserving the visual tension between human construction and natural reclamation. But this visual state also reflects a deeper archaeological reality. Angkor's decline was gradual, not sudden. For centuries, the Khmer Empire developed one of the most sophisticated urban infrastructures in the ancient world. Its hydraulic system, comprising reservoirs, canals, and barrages, allowed for large-scale rice cultivation and supported a dense population. This system is often described as one of the most advanced pre-industrial water management networks ever constructed. Yet even this engineering achievement contains unanswered questions. How exactly was water distribution coordinated across such an extensive and interconnected system? How did seasonal variations in rainfall and flooding influence urban planning decisions over centuries? And to what extent did environmental shifts contribute to the gradual decline of Angkor as a political center? Mainstream archaeology points to a combination of factors: climate variability, overextension of infrastructure, shifts in trade routes, and political transitions. Yet the precise balance of these forces remains debated. What is clear is that by the 15th century, the political center of the Khmer Empire had shifted away from Angkor. The temples were not destroyed, but they were gradually left outside the core of imperial activity. Nature slowly returned, though never fully erasing what had been built. And yet, Angkor was never truly lost in the absolute sense. Local populations maintained knowledge of the temples, and certain religious functions continued even after political decline. The idea of total disappearance is more a modern perception than a historical reality. Still, the scale of the ruins creates a powerful impression of abandonment. Walking through Angkor today, it is difficult to fully comprehend the original density of occupation. Estimates suggest that Angkor may have been one of the largest pre-industrial cities in the world, with populations possibly reaching hundreds of thousands. But unlike modern cities, its boundaries are not clearly defined. Urban and sacred spaces blend into one another, making the distinction between temple, city, and landscape fluid rather than fixed. This raises a fundamental question. What does it mean to define a city when its structure is distributed across an entire landscape. Even within the temples themselves, patterns emerge that are still being studied. Repeated architectural motifs, precise astronomical alignments, and symbolic spatial arrangements suggest that Angkor's builders were deeply attentive to cosmic cycles and environmental rhythms. Some temples appear to align with solstices or equinox-related orientations, though interpretations vary depending on methodology and reconstruction. Were these alignments intentional astronomical systems, symbolic cosmological expressions, or a combination of both? Then there is the question of inscriptions. Stone inscriptions found across Angkor provide valuable historical records of kings, donations, religious dedications, and administrative activity. Yet these inscriptions represent only a fraction of the total cultural output of the Khmer civilization. Much of its intellectual and literary tradition was likely recorded on perishable materials that have not survived the tropical climate. What has been preserved is only a partial archive, stone fragments of a much larger cultural world. And so Angkor remains both vast and incomplete in its documentation. A civilization whose physical footprint is monumental, yet whose internal narratives are partially inaccessible. Modern archaeological efforts continue to map and analyze the landscape using advanced technologies such as LiDAR scanning, which has revealed previously unknown structures beneath the forest canopy. These findings suggest that Angkor's extent may be even larger than previously understood, with hidden roads, settlements, and hydraulic features extending far beyond visible temple complexes. But each discovery also expands the scope of what remains unknown. And so the jungle continues to conceal as much as it reveals. Standing among the ruins today, where stone towers rise through dense vegetation and carved faces watch through filtered light, one final question lingers, not as conclusion, but as continuation. How much of Angkor has truly been uncovered, and how much of its vast, interconnected world still lies hidden beneath the forest, waiting to be seen again? From the overgrown temples of Angkor, where entire civilizations still breathe through stone beneath a living jungle, the narrative shifts once more across seas and volcanic arcs. The dense canopy of Southeast Asia fades into open water, into wind and salt and light scattered across the Aegean. The scale contracts, but the mystery deepens. Here, on the island of Santorini in the southern Aegean Sea, the land itself tells a story written in ash. At first glance, the modern landscape is serene, whitewashed buildings perched above cliffs, blue water stretching endlessly toward the horizon. It is a place associated with beauty, tourism, and calm Mediterranean light. But beneath this familiar surface lies a buried world that predates classical Greece by centuries. This is Akrotiri. Unlike many ancient sites that survive as ruins exposed to time, Akrotiri exists in a state of preservation that feels almost suspended. The settlement was entombed beneath volcanic ash following a massive eruption of the Thera volcano, an event that occurred around the mid-2nd millennium BC. The eruption was among the most powerful volcanic events in human history, reshaping the island's geography and sending ash across the wider eastern Mediterranean. But in its destruction, it preserved an entire Bronze Age city. Excavations at Akrotiri have revealed multi-story buildings, paved streets, drainage systems, and remarkably well-preserved frescoes. Walls still stand in places, decorated with vivid paintings that depict ships, landscapes, ritual scenes, and marine life. The level of artistic sophistication suggests a highly developed society with strong maritime connections across the Aegean world. Yet one detail immediately stands out. There are no human remains. Despite the suddenness of the volcanic event, archaeologists have found very few bodies at the site. This absence has led to one of the most enduring questions surrounding Akrotiri. Did the inhabitants escape before the final eruption, or were they already gone for reasons that remain unclear? Mainstream interpretations suggest that early warning signs, earthquakes, Ash emissions, or environmental changes may have allowed evacuation prior to the catastrophic phase of the eruption. Evidence of seismic activity has indeed been found in earlier layers of the settlement, indicating that the region experienced repeated tremors before the final destruction. But even this explanation raises further questions. If evacuation was possible, how complete was it? And if the population left in time, where did they go? And how far did their cultural influence extend afterward? Walking through Akrotiri today, the sense of an interrupted world is difficult to ignore. Streets lead into partially collapsed structures. Rooms open into spaces where frescoes still cling to plastered walls. Storage vessels remain in situ, as if moments before departure were frozen into the architecture itself. One of the most striking features of Akrotiri is the absence of overt signs of panic. Unlike disaster sites where sudden destruction leaves chaotic patterns, Akrotiri often appears carefully arranged. Objects are not scattered randomly, but positioned with a degree of order that suggests either forewarning or a structured departure process. What does it mean for a civilization to leave without leaving behind clear traces of distress? The frescoes themselves add another layer of complexity. Among the most famous are depictions of naval processions, showing ships traveling across open water between coastal settlements. The detail in these scenes suggests not only artistic skill, but a strong maritime culture, one that likely depended on trade, communication, and movement across the Aegean. Other frescoes depict landscapes that appear both familiar and symbolic. Floral patterns, wildlife, and stylized natural environments are rendered with a precision that suggests careful observation. Yet some scenes also contain elements whose interpretation remains open. Ritual gestures, symbolic objects, and abstract arrangements continue to be studied for their possible meanings within Bronze Age Aegean belief systems. What role did these images play in daily life? Were they decorative, ceremonial, educational, or part of a broader symbolic system that is only partially understood today? Beyond the artwork, Akrotiri's urban design reveals a society with advanced infrastructure. Drainage systems run beneath streets. Buildings contain multiple floors with staircases still preserved in stone. Storage rooms indicate organized economic activity, likely tied to trade networks that connected the Cycladic islands with Crete, Anatolia, and mainland Greece. Yet despite this sophistication, the identity of Akrotiri's inhabitants remains only partially known. The site is often associated with the Minoan cultural sphere, based on similarities in art and material culture with Crete. However, whether Akrotiri was fully Minoan, partially independent, or part of a broader interconnected Aegean system is still debated. The absence of written records at the site itself limits direct understanding of its political or administrative structure. This creates a subtle but persistent gap, a city whose physical world is vividly preserved, but whose internal voice is largely silent. And then there is the volcano itself. The eruption of Thera reshaped not only the island, but potentially the wider ancient world. Ash deposits have been identified across the eastern Mediterranean, and some scholars have explored possible connections between the eruption and broader climatic or cultural disruptions in the late Bronze Age. These connections remain debated, but they highlight the potential far-reaching impact of Akrotiri's destruction. Still, even the scale of the eruption does not fully explain every aspect of what is observed at the site. Why were there so few human remains? Why do some buildings appear to have been cleared rather than abandoned in haste? And why does the city feel, in certain areas, as though it was paused rather than violently disrupted? Some interpretations suggest that Akrotiri may represent not a snapshot of sudden catastrophe, but the final stage of a longer process of environmental adaptation and relocation. Others propose that its abandonment may have been planned or gradual before the eruption reached its final destructive phase. More speculative perspectives have even considered the possibility that Akrotiri preserves evidence of a broader regional transformation that is not yet fully reconstructed, a shift in settlement patterns, trade networks, or cultural centers across the Aegean during the Bronze Age collapse period. However, none of these interpretations fully resolves the silence of the site. Because Akrotiri is not defined by what was lost in destruction alone, but by what was preserved in absence. It is a city without inhabitants, yet filled with traces of human intention. A place where architecture remains, but life does not. A landscape frozen not in chaos, but in stillness. And that stillness continues to shape how it is understood today. Modern excavation has revealed only a portion of the settlement. Much remains unexcavated, still buried beneath volcanic layers or protected for future study. Each new discovery adds detail, but also expands the sense that Akrotiri is not yet fully revealed. What lies beyond the excavated streets? What additional structures, artworks, or spaces remain sealed beneath the ash? And more fundamentally, what kind of society built a city that could be so thoroughly preserved in its absence? As the narrative lingers within these ash-filled corridors and silent rooms, one question remains suspended in the stillness of Santorini's buried world. How much of Akrotiri has truly been uncovered, and how much of its civilization still rests intact beneath the volcanic ground, waiting for time to reveal what catastrophe once concealed? From the fragile silence of Akrotiri, where an entire Bronze Age world was sealed beneath volcanic ash and preserved in a moment of suspended time, the narrative shifts once more. The Aegean light fades, replaced by the muted greens and grays of northern Europe. The warmth of Mediterranean ruin gives way to something colder, quieter, and more understated. The story moves to southern England. Here, in the rolling landscape of Wiltshire, the land appears deceptively gentle. Fields stretch across low hills, hedgerows divide the countryside, and modern roads pass without interruption. Yet rising subtly from this pastoral setting is one of the most enigmatic prehistoric monuments in Europe. Silbury Hill. At first glance, it does not resemble a structure at all. There are no visible walls, no carved stones, no entrances that immediately reveal purpose or function. Instead, Silbury Hill rises as a perfectly shaped mound of chalk and earth, standing approximately 30 meters high and spanning over 160 meters at its base. It is the largest artificial mound in Europe. And yet, despite centuries of study, it does not yield a simple explanation. Constructed around 2400 BC during the late Neolithic period, Silbury Hill is part of a wider ceremonial landscape that includes Avebury Stone Circle and nearby prehistoric earthworks. Archaeological investigations have shown that its construction required an immense and sustained labor effort, involving the careful layering of chalk, soil, turf, and gravel over multiple phases. Estimates suggest millions of tons of material were moved by hand, basket by basket, layer by layer, over generations. But the question that continues to linger is not how it was built, but why. Unlike burial mounds found elsewhere in prehistoric Europe, Silbury Hill contains no confirmed human remains. Extensive excavations and tunneling investigations conducted over the centuries have failed to reveal any central tomb, chamber, or burial deposit. This absence has challenged early assumptions that it functioned as a funerary monument. If it was not a tomb, then what was it? Mainstream archaeological interpretations suggest that Silbury Hill may have served a ceremonial or ritual purpose, possibly linked to seasonal cycles, agricultural renewal, or territorial identity. Its position within the broader Avebury complex suggests it was part of a carefully designed sacred landscape, aligned not only spatially but conceptually with other Neolithic structures in the region. But even within this framework, its exact role remains uncertain. The sheer scale of the monument suggests importance far beyond a simple local gathering place. It required coordination, planning, and sustained effort across multiple generations. Such investment implies a social or spiritual significance that must have been deeply embedded in the worldview of its builders. What kind of belief system would justify the construction of a monument that conceals rather than reveals its purpose? One of the most intriguing aspects of Silbury Hill is its internal structure. Modern archaeological surveys and limited excavations have revealed a complex series of terraces and retaining layers, suggesting that the mound was not built in a single event, but through carefully staged phases. Each layer appears to have been intentionally placed, sometimes with changes in material composition, slope, and construction technique. This suggests that Silbury Hill was not simply a pile of earth, but a carefully designed architectural form, one that may have evolved over time. Yet despite this complexity, no internal chamber has been conclusively identified. Small voids and anomalies have been detected through geophysical surveys, but their interpretation remains uncertain. Are these natural irregularities within the chalk substrate, or remnants of deliberately constructed features that have yet to be fully understood? The absence of clear internal architecture continues to deepen the mystery. Then there is its relationship to the surrounding landscape. Silbury Hill is not isolated. It exists within a dense network of Neolithic monuments that include standing stones, burial mounds, and the massive circular earthwork of Avebury. This wider landscape appears to have been carefully organized, suggesting that Silbury Hill was part of a broader ceremonial geography rather than a standalone construction. Some alignments between Silbury Hill and nearby features have been noted, particularly in relation to sight lines and spatial relationships across the landscape. However, interpretations of these alignments vary, and no single consensus exists regarding their significance. Was the hill designed to be seen from specific points within the landscape? Or was its meaning more symbolic, intended to operate within a system of spatial relationships that is no longer fully visible to us today? Over time, Silbury Hill has resisted most attempts at definitive interpretation. Excavations in the 18th and 20th centuries, including early tunneling efforts, caused structural instability and led to later conservation work. These interventions revealed more about its construction layers, but did not resolve its purpose. Instead, they reinforced a central paradox. The more Silbury Hill is examined, the less certain its function becomes. Some speculative interpretations have suggested that it may have functioned as an artificial sacred horizon, a constructed landscape feature designed to interact with celestial or seasonal cycles. Others have proposed that it may have been a form of communal monument, representing collective identity or territorial marking rather than a specific ritual function. More fringe interpretations, though not supported by mainstream archaeology, have suggested astronomical, geomantic, or symbolic systems embedded within its proportions. These ideas remain outside academic consensus, but they reflect the enduring human impulse to find structure within ambiguity. And yet, Silbury Hill does not confirm or deny any of these interpretations. It remains silent. Even erosion tells only part of the story. Over thousands of years, the mound has changed subtly, yet its form has endured with remarkable stability. This persistence suggests not only careful construction, but possibly ongoing maintenance or cultural significance long after its initial creation. What does it mean for a monument to remain present in a landscape for millennia without revealing its original purpose? Unlike temples that can be interpreted through iconography, or tombs that provide direct evidence of burial practices, Silbury Hill offers almost no internal narrative. It is a structure defined by absence of entrance, absence of inscription, absence of clear function. And yet, its presence dominates the landscape in a quiet but undeniable way. Standing at its base today, one encounters not a ruin, but a form a shape that resists decay in meaning even as it slowly weathers in physical form. It does not guide interpretation. It invites it endlessly without resolution. And perhaps that is its most enduring feature. Because Silbury Hill does not behave like a monument that has lost its meaning. It behaves like a monument that was never meant to fully reveal it. As the landscape of Wiltshire stretches outward in soft green waves beneath shifting sky, one final question remains suspended in the quiet air. Was Silbury Hill a structure whose purpose has been forgotten over time, or was it designed from the beginning to remain unreadable, its meaning preserved not in answers, but in its enduring silence? From the silent enigma of Silbury Hill, where meaning itself seems buried beneath layers of earth rather than stone, the narrative moves away from prehistoric Britain and across the Mediterranean once again. The soft greens of Wiltshire fade into distance, replaced by sunlit stone and the vast stillness of North Africa. Here, in the high plains of modern-day Algeria, where the RS Mountains rise against a dry and luminous sky, lies one of the most remarkably preserved cities of the ancient Roman world, Timgad. At first sight, the ruins appear almost too orderly to be ruins at all. From above, the city reveals itself in a near-perfect grid, straight streets intersecting at right angles, forming a geometric pattern that still reads clearly after nearly 2 millennia. It feels less like a collapsed ancient city and more like a blueprint that time forgot to erase. Founded around 100 AD under Emperor Trajan, Timgad, known in antiquity as Thamugadi, was established as a Roman colonial settlement. It was intended primarily for veterans of the Roman army, a reward for service and a means of securing Roman presence in North Africa. The city was designed according to the classic Roman orthogonal plan, with a central forum, baths, library, temples, and residential blocks organized with precision. But what makes Timgad extraordinary is not only its design, it is the degree to which that design survives. Unlike many ancient cities that evolved gradually over centuries, Timgad appears almost frozen in its original urban logic. Streets still align with cardinal directions. Building foundations remain legible. Public spaces retain their spatial identity. It is a rare case where the skeleton of a Roman city is still clearly visible beneath centuries of partial collapse and desert reclamation. Yet even here, clarity does not eliminate mystery. Why was such precision so rigorously implemented in this particular location, deep within the North African interior? And how did this highly ordered urban vision interact with the landscape and cultures that existed before and around it? Mainstream archaeological understanding places Timgad within the broader Roman strategy of provincial integration. The city was not built in isolation, but as part of a network of colonies designed to project Roman administrative, cultural, and military presence across the empire. Its grid system reflects ideals of order, control, and civic organization that were central to Roman urban planning. And yet, the lived reality of Timgad may have been more complex than its geometric layout suggests. Excavations have revealed layers of occupation that extend beyond the initial foundation period. As centuries passed, buildings were modified, repurposed, and in some cases abandoned. Christian basilicas were added later, reflecting the gradual transformation of religious life within the Roman Empire. Markets shifted location, streets adapted to changing patterns of movement and trade. Timgad was not static. It evolved. But its evolution raises deeper questions about how such a rigid urban structure adapts over time. How does a city designed with such strict geometry respond to organic social change? Does the grid constrain life within it, or does life reshape the grid in subtle ways that are not immediately visible in the archaeological record? Among the most striking features of Timgad is its forum, the civic heart of the city. Surrounded by columns and administrative buildings, it would have functioned as a space for political discourse, trade, and public life. Nearby, the Capitolium Temple stood dedicated to the Capitoline triad of Roman deities, symbolizing the religious dimension of imperial authority. Yet even these central spaces are not fully understood in terms of daily experience. What did it feel like to inhabit a city so carefully ordered? Did residents perceive the grid as a form of stability, or as an imposed structure that shaped movement and behavior in subtle but constant ways? Beyond the Forum, the Library of Timgad stands as one of the most intriguing structures in the city. Though only partially preserved, its existence points to a culture that valued knowledge, documentation, and civic education. The presence of such a building in a relatively remote provincial city suggests that intellectual life was not confined to major metropolitan centers like Rome or Alexandria, but extended throughout the empire in distributed forms. However, the content of that intellectual life is largely lost. What texts were held here? What ideas circulated through its corridors? And how much of that knowledge was shared, adapted, or transformed by the local population over time? Then there are the baths, an essential feature of Roman urban life. At Timgad, the bath complex is particularly well preserved, with visible remains of heating systems, pools, and changing rooms. These spaces were not only functional, but social, serving as centers of interaction and daily rhythm. Yet even here, questions remain about usage patterns across different periods. Did the baths maintain consistent function throughout the city's occupation, or did their role shift as political and economic conditions changed? Over time, Timgad experienced decline, particularly after the disruption of Roman authority in North Africa during the late antiquity period. The city was gradually abandoned, and its structures began to collapse or be buried by shifting sands. By the time of later medieval and modern periods, it had largely fallen out of active use, preserved instead beneath layers of desert sediment. And in this abandonment lies another layer of complexity. Unlike cities destroyed in a single moment, Timgad's decline appears gradual. There is no singular catastrophic event that defines its end. Instead, it fades, slowly transitioning from active urban center to archaeological site. But gradual decline often leaves more interpretive gaps than sudden destruction. There is no final moment to anchor the narrative, only a slow dispersal of population, function, and memory. Why did the city's grid remain so intact while its life within it diminished? Was it economic change, political instability, environmental pressure, or a combination of forces that gradually shifted human activity elsewhere? And what remains beneath the visible layers of the city? Some areas of Timgad remain only partially excavated. Subsurface surveys suggest additional structures beyond the mapped urban core, possibly extending the original boundaries or revealing earlier phases of occupation not yet fully understood. Each new layer uncovered adds detail but also complexity, reinforcing the sense that the city's full history is not yet completely visible. Even the precision of its design invites further reflection. Roman urbanism is often understood as a system of order imposed upon landscape. But at Timgad, that order becomes something more enduring, something that outlasts the political structures that created it. The city grid survives long after the empire that designed it has disappeared. What does it mean for an idea of urban order to persist longer than the civilization that conceived it? Today, walking through Timgad is like moving through a frozen diagram of ancient life. Columns stand without roofs. Streets lead into empty intersections. The wind moves through spaces that once carried the sound of commerce, conversation, and civic activity. It is a city reduced to structure, yet still unmistakably present. And perhaps that is where its mystery endures most strongly. Not in what has been lost, but in what remains so perfectly legible despite loss. As the narrative moves forward from these geometric ruins into other forgotten landscapes of the ancient world, one question lingers in the quiet symmetry of Timgad's streets. How much of this city has truly been understood, and how much of its lived reality still lies hidden within the silent order of its stone foundations? From the silent geometry of Timgad, where Roman order still lingers in the dust like a blueprint of an empire that has long since vanished, the narrative shifts once more. The straight streets of North Africa dissolve into heat, river winds, and vast desert horizons. The land opens outward, following the slow rhythm of the Nile. Here, between southern Egypt and northern Sudan, rises a landscape shaped not only by river and stone, but by one of the most powerful yet often overlooked civilizations of the ancient world. The Kingdom of Kush. At first, the setting feels almost deceptive in its stillness. The Nile flows steadily through desert valleys, bordered by golden sands and rocky outcrops. Yet scattered across this landscape are the remains of cities, temples, pyramids, and royal cemeteries that speak of a kingdom once deeply intertwined with both Egyptian civilization and its own distinct cultural identity. Kush was not a peripheral civilization. It was a power in its own right, one that rose, fell, and rose again across more than 1,000 years, roughly from around 1000 BC to the early centuries AD. Its centers of power shifted over time, from Napata in the north to Meroe further south, each leaving behind architectural and cultural traces that still challenge simple interpretation. But what makes Kush particularly compelling is not only its history of kings and conquests, it is the way its legacy remains partially fragmented, preserved in stone, yet still incomplete in meaning. At Napata, near the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, temples rise from the desert floor in weathered but recognizable form. This site was once a major religious and political center of the Kushite kingdom, deeply connected to Egyptian religious traditions, yet also expressing uniquely Kushite interpretations of kingship and divinity. Egyptian-style deities appear in temple reliefs, but they are not identical to their northern counterparts. Iconography is adapted, reinterpreted, and sometimes combined with local symbolism in ways that suggest a dynamic cultural exchange rather than simple imitation. How did Kushite rulers perceive this relationship with Egypt? Was it one of inheritance, rivalry, transformation, or something more fluid that shifted across generations? At one point in its history, Kush even extended its influence northward, ruling over Egypt as the 25th dynasty during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. This period, often referred to in historical records as the Kushite dynasty, represents one of the rare moments in which power flowed south to north along the Nile rather than the reverse. Yet this reversal of influence raises further questions. How did Kushite rulers integrate Egyptian religious and political systems while maintaining their own identity? And how much of Kush's internal history during this period is shaped by Egyptian records rather than Kushite voices themselves? Because one of the enduring challenges in understanding Kush is the imbalance of written sources. Much of what is known about Kush comes from external accounts, particularly Egyptian and later Greco-Roman sources. Indigenous Kushite writing exists, including inscriptions in Meroitic script, but despite decades of study, the Meroitic language remains only partially deciphered. Its phonetic system is understood to some extent, but its full vocabulary and grammatical structure are still not completely resolved. This means that a significant portion of Kush's internal narrative remains linguistically inaccessible. What stories were recorded in Meroitic texts that have yet to be fully understood? What historical events, rituals, or royal decrees remain encoded in inscriptions that cannot yet be fully read? As the political center shifted southward to Meroe, the kingdom entered a new phase of cultural development. Meroe is often described as a city of iron production, where large-scale metallurgy played a central role in economic and technological life. Archaeological evidence shows extensive ironworking sites, slag heaps, and workshop areas, suggesting a highly organized production system. But even this industrial dimension raises questions. How was iron production organized at a state level? Was it centrally controlled or distributed among elite and local workshops? And how did this technological capacity influence Kush's political power and regional interactions? The pyramids of Meroe add another layer of complexity. Unlike the massive pyramids of Egypt's Old Kingdom, Kushite pyramids are smaller, steeper, and more numerous. They were used as royal and elite burial structures, forming dense necropolises that still rise from the desert sands in striking geometric clusters. These pyramids reflect both continuity and divergence from Egyptian funerary traditions. They demonstrate cultural connection, yet also clear adaptation and independence. Inside these burial complexes, artifacts such as pottery, jewelry, and ritual objects have been discovered, offering glimpses into beliefs surrounding death and the afterlife. Yet many tombs have been disturbed over time, and the full context of their contents is often incomplete. What rituals accompanied these burials that are no longer visible in the archaeological record? And how did Kushite conceptions of the afterlife evolve across centuries of cultural interaction with Egypt and neighboring regions? Beyond royal centers, everyday life in Kush remains less visible but no less significant. Settlements along the Nile reveal agricultural systems adapted to the rhythms of seasonal flooding. Irrigation practices, crop cultivation, and animal husbandry formed the backbone of Kushite society, sustaining both urban centers and rural communities. Yet even here, the archaeological record is uneven. Organic materials have largely decayed in the harsh environmental conditions, leaving behind stone foundations, pottery fragments, and occasional inscriptions. The texture of daily life must therefore be reconstructed through partial evidence, leaving inevitable gaps in understanding. What did ordinary life in Kush feel like beyond the royal and ceremonial spheres? How were social structures organized across different regions of the kingdom? And then there is the question of transformation. Over time, Kush experienced shifts in political power, economic networks, and regional influence. By the 4th century AD, the kingdom of Meroe gradually declined, eventually giving way to new political formations in the region. The reasons for this transition are still debated, involving possible factors such as changes in trade routes, environmental pressures, and shifting regional dynamics. But no single explanation fully accounts for the complexity of its decline. There is no definitive moment of collapse, no singular event that marks the end of Kush as a civilization. Instead, there is a gradual fading of centralized power, accompanied by changes in settlement patterns and material culture. And yet, even after political structures diminished, cultural memory did not disappear entirely. Elements of Kushite identity persisted in later Nubian kingdoms, suggesting continuity beneath transformation rather than total rupture. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new aspects of Kushite civilization, particularly at sites that remain only partially excavated. Satellite imagery and ground surveys suggest that additional settlements, temples, and burial sites may still lie beneath the sands of Sudan and Egypt, waiting to be studied. Each discovery adds depth, but also expands the horizon of what is still unknown. And so Kush remains both visible and partially obscured, its monuments standing in the desert, its language only partly understood, its internal history still being reconstructed piece by piece. Standing among the pyramids of Meroe or the temples of Napata, one is confronted not only with the legacy of a kingdom, but with the limits of historical visibility itself. Stone endures, but meaning shifts. Inscriptions survive, but their full voices are not always recoverable. And so the silence of Kush is not emptiness. It is incompleteness. As the narrative continues along the Nile and beyond, one question remains suspended in the heat and dust of these ancient landscapes. How much of the kingdom of Kush has truly been recovered, and how much of its story still lies hidden, waiting beneath the sands and within the undeciphered words of its own forgotten voice? This absence of written or symbolic explanation leaves interpretation open, but also uncertain, and so the jars remain silent. Over time, natural processes have altered the landscape significantly. Some jars have been damaged or displaced due to erosion, vegetation growth, and more recent historical events. During the 20th century, the region was heavily affected by conflict, and unexploded ordnance still present in parts of the landscape has complicated archaeological access and preservation efforts. This modern layer of history adds another dimension to the site, not as part of its ancient origin, but as part of its continued vulnerability. Even today, only a portion of the plain of jars has been fully surveyed or cleared for study. New sites continue to be documented, sometimes in remote or previously inaccessible areas. Each discovery expands the known distribution of jars, but also raises further questions about the full extent of the tradition. How many jars remain undiscovered in forested or unexplored regions? And what patterns might emerge if the entire landscape were mapped in detail? Some speculative interpretations, outside mainstream archaeology, have suggested alternative functions for the jars, ranging from water storage to ceremonial offerings or astronomical alignments. However, these ideas remain unconfirmed and are not supported by current physical evidence. The prevailing archaeological consensus continues to emphasize funerary or mortuary-related uses. Still, even within the accepted framework, much remains unresolved. The scale alone continues to provoke reflection. The effort required to carve, transport, and place hundreds of stone jars across a vast and varied landscape implies a society with sustained organizational capacity and shared cultural purpose over long periods of time. What sustained this practice across generations? What belief system made such effort meaningful enough to persist? And why did it eventually come to an end? There is no clear record of when or why the construction and use of the jars ceased. The transition appears gradual, absorbed into broader regional historical changes that are not fully documented in the archaeological record. And so the plain of jars does not conclude with collapse, but with silence. A silence shaped not by destruction, but by discontinuation. Today, as mist moves through the valleys of Laos and settles between stone vessels scattered across the hills, the site remains both visible and unreadable. It is a landscape that clearly preserves human intention, yet withholds its full explanation. And perhaps that is what gives it its enduring power. Because standing among these stone jars, arranged across open ground and forest edges, one question remains suspended in the quiet air. What kind of world created this vast and silent field of stone, and how much of its meaning still waits beneath the surface of the land itself? From the quiet endurance of the kingdom of Kush, where rivers carried memory through desert civilizations and meanings still linger in undeciphered scripts, the narrative shifts once more. The Nile's heat fades into mist and forest, into folded hills and remote valleys where the land becomes less open, more secretive. The journey turns eastward into mainland Southeast Asia, toward a landscape that does not immediately reveal its history. Here, in the highlands of northern Laos, the earth appears scattered with stone. But these are not ordinary stones. They are massive, cylindrical jars, some standing upright, others tilted or partially buried, spread across plains, ridges, and forested clearings in a pattern that seems at once deliberate and dispersed. This is the plain of jars. At first encounter, the site feels almost surreal. Hundreds of stone vessels, some weighing several tons, are arranged across multiple clusters that stretch over a wide geographical area. The jars vary in size, from small containers to monumental forms taller than an adult human. Many are weathered by time, their surfaces softened by centuries of rain, wind, and vegetation. and yet their presence remains unmistakable. Who created them, and for what purpose? Archaeological studies suggest that the jars date back to the Iron Age, roughly between 500 BC and 500 AD, though exact chronology remains debated due to limited organic material available for precise dating. The jars are carved from sandstone, granite, and other durable rock types not always native to the immediate surroundings, implying that materials were transported from distant quarry sites. This alone raises immediate questions about the scale of effort involved. How were these massive stones moved across uneven terrain without advanced mechanical systems? What kind of social organization would be required to coordinate such labor across multiple sites? Mainstream archaeological interpretations propose that the plain of jars was used primarily for funerary practices. Excavations have uncovered human remains, burial goods, ceramic fragments, and evidence of cremation in association with some jar sites. This has led to the widely accepted hypothesis that the jars functioned as funerary urns or part of complex mortuary rituals. In this view, the jars may have been used to store bodies temporarily or to hold remains after decomposition or cremation before secondary burial in nearby locations. But even within this interpretation, the system is not fully uniform. Not all jars contain clear evidence of human remains. Not all clusters show identical patterns of associated artifacts. And not all sites appear to follow the same ritual sequence. Why such variation across a landscape that otherwise appears culturally connected? At some locations, stone discs have been found near jar clusters. These discs are often interpreted as lids, though many do not fit precisely onto the jars they are found near. Some appear too small, others too large, and many are positioned slightly offset from the openings they might have covered. Were these discs functional covers, symbolic markers, or something else entirely? And then there is the question of landscape placement. The jars are not arranged in a single centralized complex. Instead, they are distributed across more than 100 sites, often located on elevated ground, hilltops, or natural clearings. This suggests that the plain of jars was not a single construction event, but a long-term cultural practice spanning generations or even centuries. But why choose these specific locations? Some researchers suggest that elevation may have held symbolic significance, perhaps relating to ancestral spirits, sky cosmology, or territorial markers visible across valleys. Others propose more practical explanations, such as drainage, preservation, or ease of ritual access. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the consistency of elevation preference across such a wide region. Another layer of complexity comes from the surrounding archaeological context. The region of northern Laos is not isolated culturally. It lies within broader ancient trade and migration networks that connected parts of Southeast Asia, southern China, and the Mekong Basin. Ceramic styles, metallurgical evidence, and burial practices in the region suggest interaction with multiple cultural traditions over time. Could the plain of jars represent a convergence of different cultural influences rather than a single unified tradition? Or does it reflect a local belief system that absorbed external influences while maintaining its own distinct identity? The jars themselves do not provide direct answers. Unlike inscriptions or figurative carvings, they carry no explicit visual language. Their meaning is inferred entirely through context, placement, association, and comparison with other burial practices in the region. From the silent fields of the plain of jars, where stone vessels lie scattered across mist-covered valleys like questions carved into the earth itself, the narrative shifts once more. The forests of Southeast Asia fade into distance, and the journey returns westward across continents and seas. The terrain changes again, from tropical highlands to the sunlit, rugged landscapes of the Mediterranean. Here, on the island of Sardinia, the land rises in rocky plateaus and windswept hills, where ancient stone structures emerge from the earth like remnants of a forgotten architectural language. These are the nurag. At first glance, they resemble primitive towers, massive stone structures built from large basalt blocks stacked without mortar. Some stand alone like solitary sentinels, while others form complex clusters of towers connected by walls, courtyards, and passageways. Dotted across the Sardinian landscape are more than 7,000 of these structures, forming one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric architecture in Europe. They date primarily to the Bronze Age, beginning around the 18th century BC and continuing for over 1,000 years, associated with the Nuragic civilization. And yet, despite decades of archaeological study, their full purpose remains only partially understood. At their core, nuragi are architectural enigmas. Some appear to function as defensive fortifications, with thick walls, elevated entrances, and narrow internal staircases that could provide strategic advantage. Others seem more symbolic or ceremonial, lacking clear evidence of military use. Many contain internal chambers arranged in circular or beehive-like forms, often stacked in multiple levels, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of load-bearing stone construction. But why build such a vast network of monumental stone towers across an entire island? Mainstream archaeological interpretations propose that nuragae served multiple functions simultaneously: fortresses, administrative centers, meeting places, and possibly religious or ritual structures. Rather than a single purpose, they may represent a flexible architectural system adapted to different local needs across time. Yet even this multifunctional explanation leaves gaps. Some nuragi are isolated, standing alone in remote landscapes with no clear surrounding settlement. Others are integrated into larger complexes with villages, wells, and sacred enclosures. This variation raises questions about whether these structures were unified under a single cultural blueprint or developed regionally with differing intentions. What determined whether a nuraga stood alone or became part of a larger settlement network? Inside many of these towers, archaeologists have discovered artifacts such as pottery, bronze tools, and ritual objects. One of the most distinctive aspects of Nuragic culture is its bronze figurines, small, stylized representations of warriors, animals, boats, and deities. These figurines suggest a society with strong symbolic expression, particularly in relation to identity, status, and possibly spiritual belief. But their exact meaning remains open to interpretation. Are they representations of real individuals, mythological figures, or symbolic archetypes tied to social roles? The architectural sophistication of the nuraga also raises deeper technical questions. Constructed without mortar, these towers rely entirely on the precise placement of massive stones, some weighing several tons. The inner chambers often feature corbelled vaulting, a technique where each successive layer of stone slightly overlaps the one below until the structure closes at the top. This method creates stable, self-supporting domes that have survived for nearly 3,000 years. How was such engineering knowledge developed and transmitted across generations? And what systems of planning or measurement allowed for such consistency across thousands of structures scattered throughout the island? Beyond individual towers, the Nuragic landscape includes other mysterious features. Sacred wells, known as pozzi sacri, which are constructed with remarkable precision. These subterranean or semi-subterranean structures often include carefully cut stone stairways descending toward water sources. The geometry of some of these wells suggests intentional alignment with astronomical cycles, particularly lunar or solar events, though interpretations vary. Were these wells purely functional water sources, or did they serve a ceremonial role connected to water worship, seasonal cycles, or cosmological beliefs? The relationship between water and sacred architecture in Nuragic culture continues to be a subject of study. In many ancient societies, Water was not only a resource, but also a symbolic boundary between worlds, the living and the divine, the visible and the hidden. Could the sacred wells of Sardinia reflect such a worldview? Then there is the question of external influence. Sardinia was not isolated in the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence indicates contact with Mycenaean Greece, Phoenician traders, and other Mediterranean cultures. Objects found in neuralgic sites include imported pottery and materials that suggest participation in wider exchange networks. But despite these connections, the neuralgic civilization maintained a highly distinctive architectural and cultural identity. Why did this island develop such a unique monumental tradition compared to neighboring regions? Some scholars suggest that the neuralgi may reflect a form of social organization that emphasized localized power structures rather than centralized states. Each tower or cluster could represent a community, clan, or territorial unit, creating a fragmented but interconnected cultural landscape. Yet this explanation still does not fully account for the sheer scale of construction. Thousands of stone towers, built over centuries, require sustained coordination and shared cultural motivation. What belief system or social structure could support such long-term architectural continuity? And why did this tradition eventually fade? By the end of the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age, the neuralgic civilization gradually transformed under increasing Phoenician and later Roman influence. New settlements emerged, older structures were repurposed, and many neurag were abandoned or incorporated into later cultural systems. But unlike civilizations that disappear suddenly, the neuralgic world seems to dissolve gradually, absorbed rather than erased. And yet, the towers remain. Standing in isolation or clustered across hillsides, they continue to dominate the Sardinian landscape. Their entrances are dark, their interiors silent, their upper chambers open to sky and wind. Time has not reduced them to ruins in the conventional sense. Instead, it has left them suspended between function and memory. Modern archaeology continues to document and interpret these structures, but many remain unexcavated or only partially studied. Each new survey reveals additional variations in design, suggesting that neuralgic architecture may be even more diverse than previously understood. How many neurags still remain undiscovered beneath soil and vegetation? And how many variations of form and function have yet to be fully classified? Even today, standing beside one of these stone towers, there is a sense that they are not entirely silent. Not because they speak directly, but because they continue to resist a single definition. They are fortresses, yet not only fortresses. They are monuments, yet not only monuments. They are domestic spaces, ritual spaces, defensive spaces, and something that extends beyond all of these categories. And so they remain, scattered across the island like a network of unanswered questions embedded in stone. As the narrative continues beyond Sardinia into other forgotten architectures of the ancient world, one final question lingers in the shadow of these enduring towers. Were the neurag ever meant to be understood as individual structures? Or are they fragments of a larger system whose full design is still waiting to be recognized beneath the surface of the island itself? The desert had already begun to surrender its heat when the shadows of the columns stretched across the stone like dark rivers. Along the eastern bank of the Nile, where the modern city of Luxor now stands above layers of forgotten memory, the Temple of Karnak rises not as a single monument, but as a landscape of devotion and ambition carved into stone. And perhaps that is where this next mystery begins. For after wandering through ruins shaped by vanished kings and broken civilizations, we arrive at a place that feels less like architecture and more like accumulated time itself. Karnak does not reveal itself all at once. Its walls emerge gradually from the dust and sunlight, massive yet strangely silent, as though the complex is still listening for voices that disappeared thousands of years ago. The sandstone glows with shifting shades of gold and amber beneath the Egyptian sky. Weathered pylons stand like mountain cliffs. Fallen statues lie half buried in the earth, and between them, corridors of shadow pull the eye inward, deeper into a city of temples built not for ordinary life, but for the realm of gods. Today, Karnak is recognized as one of the largest religious complexes ever constructed. Yet even that description feels insufficient. Because Karnak was never merely a temple, it was an evolving sacred world. Construction began around the Middle Kingdom and continued through the New Kingdom and later periods, spanning nearly 2,000 years. Pharaoh after pharaoh left their mark here, adding courtyards, shrines, obelisks, sanctuaries, and colossal gateways. Rather than replacing what came before, they built over it, around it, and sometimes against it. The result is not a symmetrical monument designed by a single mind, but a layered record of power, faith, and memory. At the center of this immense complex stood devotion to Amun, the hidden god who would later merge with Ra, becoming Amun-Ra, the supreme deity of imperial Egypt. To ancient Egyptians, Karnak was known as Ipet Sut, often translated as the most select of places. The name itself invites questions. Selected by whom, and for what purpose? Approaching Karnak through its ancient processional route, visitors would once have passed between rows of ram-headed sphinxes. Their carved faces still gaze outward with a calm, unreadable authority. These avenues connected Karnak to Luxor Temple several kilometers away and played a role in sacred ceremonies, particularly the Opet festival. During this celebration, the statue of Amun traveled from Karnak to Luxor in an elaborate procession. Priests carried the god's shrine while crowds gathered along the route. Music filled the air. Incense drifted beneath banners and sunlight. For the people of Egypt, this was not symbolic theater. The god was believed to be truly present, and Karnak was his earthly dwelling. That idea shaped everything. Unlike modern buildings designed for convenience or public gathering, Karnak was built to guide movement through increasing levels of sanctity. The further inward one traveled, the more restricted the space became. Outer courts allowed broader access, while inner sanctuaries remained the domain of priests and kings. The architecture itself became a spiritual journey. Light gave way to shadow. Open sky narrowed into enclosed stone. The world of ordinary life receded behind towering walls. Even now, walking through Karnak can feel strangely disorienting. Distances distort. Scale becomes difficult to judge. A doorway large enough for giants leads into chambers where silence settles heavily against the skin. And nowhere is this sensation more powerful than within the great hypostyle hall. It is among the most extraordinary spaces of the ancient world. Covering nearly 50,000 square feet, the hall contains 134 colossal columns arranged in ordered rows. Some rise over 60 feet high. Their capitals bloom like papyrus plants frozen in stone, supporting what was once a roof that filtered sunlight into shifting shafts of illumination. Standing there today, one can still imagine the effect. A forest of stone. A man-made wilderness. The columns are covered with reliefs and inscriptions, scenes of offerings, warfare, divine approval, and royal legitimacy. Pharaohs such as Seti I and Ramesses II recorded their triumphs upon these surfaces, presenting themselves as guardians of cosmic order. Mainstream archaeology explains the hall as both ceremonial and symbolic. Its columns likely represented the primordial marsh from which creation emerged according to Egyptian belief. Moving through the hall was not simply entering a building, it was entering creation itself. And yet, alongside these accepted interpretations, Karnak has long attracted another kind of attention. Not because its history is uncertain, but because its certainty still leaves room for wonder. One of the enduring questions surrounding Karnak involves its sheer scale and precision. How was such a place built? The conventional answer is both practical and remarkable. Tens of thousands of laborers, artisans, engineers, and administrators worked across generations. Stone blocks were quarried, transported along the Nile, and raised using ramps, sledges, ropes, and organized manpower. Ancient Egypt possessed sophisticated administrative systems capable of coordinating immense projects. The evidence for this is substantial. And still, standing beneath those columns, some visitors feel that explanation describes the mechanics without fully capturing the experience. The stones seem almost impossibly large. The spaces feel engineered for emotion as much as function. This emotional response has helped nourish more speculative interpretations. Some researchers outside academic consensus have suggested that Karnak may have served purposes beyond ritual alone. They point to unusual acoustic properties within certain chambers and halls. Even today, sounds behave unpredictably in parts of the complex. A whispered voice can carry farther than expected. Footsteps shift and echo between columns. Could ancient architects have intentionally designed these effects? Many scholars argue that acoustics naturally emerge within monumental stone spaces, and that ceremonial chanting likely benefited from such resonance without requiring hidden technologies. Yet others wonder whether sound itself played a more central role in temple rituals than we fully understand. Ancient Egyptian religion emphasized spoken formulas and sacred utterances. Words possessed power. Ritual speech could sustain cosmic order, invoke divine presence, or guide souls through death. If sound mattered profoundly, might temple design have reflected that importance in ways still not fully appreciated? The mystery deepens when attention turns upward. Karnak was not built randomly across the landscape. Its orientation reveals careful planning tied to both geography and the heavens. Several structures align with solar events and celestial observations. The temple's axis appears connected to the winter solstice sunrise, when sunlight penetrates particular sections of the complex. Such alignments are not unique to Karnak. Ancient cultures around the world tracked celestial cycles through architecture. For Egypt, astronomy served practical and sacred purposes alike. The stars regulated agricultural life through the flooding of the Nile. Priests observed celestial patterns for calendars and rituals. The sky was not separate from religion. It was woven into it. And yet, once again, accepted explanations coexist with more speculative possibilities. Some alternative theorists have proposed that Karnak functioned as a kind of astronomical machine or encoded celestial map, preserving knowledge now lost or only partially understood. They point to alignments between temples, obelisks, and sacred pathways, suggesting an integrated system of cosmic symbolism extending across Egypt. Archaeologists generally view such claims cautiously, emphasizing that symbolic alignments do not necessarily imply hidden technologies or secret scientific systems. Still, the question lingers. How much meaning remains invisible to modern eyes? Because meaning, after all, is often the first casualty of time. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Karnak's obelisks. These towering monuments, carved from single pieces of granite, once pierced the sky like frozen beams of sunlight. The most famous surviving example at Karnak belongs to Hatshepsut, one of Egypt's most powerful rulers. Even today, her obelisk commands attention. Its polished stone still carries inscriptions praising Amun and celebrating royal devotion. When newly erected, it would have gleamed brilliantly, reflecting sunlight across temple courts. Transporting and raising such structures remains among the most impressive achievements of ancient engineering. Mainstream reconstructions describe carefully organized quarrying, river transport, and mechanical techniques involving ramps and manpower. But alternative interpretations persist. How, some ask, could monoliths of such size be moved with Bronze Age technology alone? Were ancient methods more advanced than traditionally imagined? Or have modern observers underestimated what coordinated human labor can accomplish? The debate is not merely technical. It touches something deeper. A tendency to view ancient civilizations either as impossibly primitive or impossibly advanced, leaving little room for the reality that human ingenuity has always exceeded expectation. And Karnak encourages precisely this kind of reflection. Because every answer seems to uncover another question. Beneath the visible temple lies another hidden world. Excavations have revealed foundations, dismantled structures, reused stones, and buried layers from earlier periods. Karnak was continuously altered. New rulers erased predecessors, recycled monuments, and reshaped sacred space according to changing politics and theology. Perhaps the most dramatic example emerged during the religious revolution associated with Akhenaten. Rejecting traditional worship centered on Amun, Akhenaten promoted devotion to the Aten and ordered temples dedicated to older gods dismantled or suppressed. At Karnak, blocks from Aten temples were later reused as filler within subsequent constructions. These so-called Talatot blocks remained hidden for centuries. A temple concealed inside another temple. History buried deliberately beneath history. And this raises an unsettling thought. How much of Karnak remains unseen, not through supernatural concealment, but through ordinary layers of stone and time? Modern technology has begun probing these questions through ground surveys and archaeological investigation. New discoveries continue to emerge. Hidden chambers, unknown foundations, fragments of inscriptions waiting to be assembled. Karnak is not finished revealing itself. Yet some theories venture beyond archaeology entirely. Among fringe interpretations, Karnak has been linked to ideas involving earth energies, geomagnetic forces, and sacred geography. Certain writers argue that major temples were positioned upon natural energy lines, designed to channel subtle forces through ritual architecture. These concepts remain controversial and lack support within conventional archaeology. But they persist, perhaps because Karnak genuinely feels unusual. The sacred lake contributes to this atmosphere. Located within the complex, this large artificial basin once served ritual purification purposes. Priests cleansed themselves before ceremonies, and sacred rites unfolded beside its still waters. At dusk, the lake becomes strangely reflective. The wind quiets. Columns and pylons mirror themselves upon the surface. Ancient texts describe the primeval waters from which creation emerged, and here that mythology seems unexpectedly close. Some visitors describe sensations difficult to articulate: heightened awareness, stillness, or the impression that the temple possesses a presence beyond stone. Psychologists might explain such experiences through scale, expectation, and environmental atmosphere. Monumental spaces can profoundly shape perception, but explanation does not necessarily erase experience, and perhaps that distinction matters. Karnak has survived conquest, neglect, earthquakes, and shifting belief systems. Persian rulers, Greek dynasties, Roman administrators, Christian communities, and later Islamic societies all inherited its presence. Portions fell into ruin. Sand buried entire sections. Villages rose among collapsed walls. Yet the temple endured, not untouched, but persistent. Its survival creates another subtle mystery. Why do certain places continue exerting influence long after the worlds that created them disappear? Perhaps the answer lies not in hidden forces, but in memory itself. Karnak was designed to overwhelm, to place human beings in contact with something larger than themselves. Whether that presence was understood as divine power, royal authority, cosmic order, or sacred landscape, the effect remains surprisingly intact. Even stripped of priests and ceremonies, the architecture still works. It still alters perception. And so we find ourselves standing once more between certainty and uncertainty. We know who built Karnak. We know much about its religion, politics, and construction. Its inscriptions speak clearly across millennia. And yet clarity is not the same as completeness. The temple continues to hold spaces where knowledge fades into interpretation, where physical evidence meets human imagination. Perhaps that is why Karnak refuses to become merely an archaeological site. It remains, in some quiet sense, unfinished. As evening settles across Luxor and the last light touches the columns of the hypostyle hall, the shadows lengthen once again through corridors built for gods and kings. Somewhere beneath the surviving stones may rest forgotten chambers, erased histories, or meanings not yet recognized. And as the desert wind moves softly through broken gateways, one question lingers beneath all the others. After thousands of years of study, are we looking at Karnak as its builders intended, or only at the fragments they allowed time to leave behind? Beyond the windswept deserts of Ica, where engraved stones blurred the boundary between artifact and interpretation, another mystery waits far from Peru's dry valleys. Here, the landscape changes entirely. Sand and rock give way to dense forests, mountain mist, and the steady sound of flowing water. Yet the same quiet question remains. What survives beneath the surface of forgotten worlds, waiting to be understood? Deep within the green highlands of Costa Rica, on the slopes of the Turrialba volcano, lies a place where the jungle seems to breathe around ancient stone. The air is heavy with moisture. Mist drifts through towering trees. Vines hang between branches. Rainwater moves through narrow channels cut into the earth, disappearing beneath roots and moss-covered rocks. At first glance, the landscape feels untouched, shaped only by forest and time. And then, almost unexpectedly, the stones appear. Circular foundations rise from the ground. Carefully laid pathways wind through the vegetation. Mounds and terraces emerge beneath layers of green. Stone stairways lead toward spaces that no longer hold houses, voices, or firelight. This is Guayabo. Known today as the Guayabo National Monument, it preserves the remains of one of the most significant pre-Columbian settlements in Central America. Yet unlike the towering pyramids of Egypt or the massive temples of Mesoamerica, Guayabo carries its mystery differently. It does not dominate the landscape. It waits within it. The settlement flourished long before European arrival, with occupation dating back perhaps as early as 1000 BC, reaching its height between roughly AD 700 and AD 1400. Archaeologists associate the site with what is often called the Guayabo culture, though the true name used by its inhabitants has been lost to history. That absence matters, because names preserve identity, and here identity has faded. We do not know precisely what these people called themselves, what language filled these forests, or what stories they shared beneath the volcanic sky. What remains are traces, stone, water, and carefully organized space. And those traces suggest something remarkably sophisticated. Guayabo covers only a portion of what may once have been a far larger settlement. Archaeological studies indicate that much of the ancient city still lies buried beneath forest and soil. The visible remains reveal paved roads, bridges, retaining walls, ceremonial platforms, aqueducts, and circular foundations believed to support homes or communal structures. Among its most striking features is the water system. Even today, portions of Guayabo's aqueducts continue functioning. Stone-lined channels direct mountain water through the settlement with surprising precision. Some routes guide water downhill through carefully engineered gradients. Others pass beneath structures or alongside pathways. For archaeologists, this hydraulic system offers important clues. It reflects planning, organization, an understanding of terrain and engineering developed through generations of observation. Mainstream scholarship views Guayabo as a regional political and ceremonial center, possibly governed by complex chiefdoms that coordinated trade, agriculture, and social life. Costa Rica, before European contact, was not an empty wilderness or isolated frontier. It was home to diverse societies connected through exchange networks extending across Central America. Guayabo appears to have been one such hub. Yet for all that archaeology has revealed, much remains uncertain. Unlike civilizations that left written records, Guayabo speaks without text. Its stones do not preserve royal histories or religious scriptures. No inscriptions explain its purpose. No surviving manuscripts identify its rulers or describe the events that unfolded here. Interpretation depends largely upon architecture itself. And architecture, while eloquent, rarely answers every question. Walking through Guayabo today produces an unusual sensation. The city feels ordered, intentional. Paths intersect with apparent logic. Circular mounds vary in size and position, suggesting social organization rather than random placement. Large central areas may have served ceremonial or communal purposes. Yet the forest softens certainty. Roots displace stone. Rain obscures edges. The jungle both protects and conceals. This uncertainty has encouraged deeper questions about the people who lived here. Who were they? How large was their population? And perhaps most intriguingly, why was the settlement abandoned? The mainstream explanation is cautious. Many archaeologists believe Guayabo gradually declined before Spanish arrival, possibly due to environmental pressures, changing trade routes, social transformation, disease, or political instability. Ancient settlements often evolved, dispersed, or shifted according to changing circumstances. Abandonment, after all, is rarely a single event. It is often a process. And yet Guayabo invites speculation precisely because its ending remains unclear. The city appears to have supported substantial populations and coordinated construction projects. Its infrastructure suggests continuity and planning. And still, at some point, life withdrew. The roads remained. The water channels endured. But the people disappeared into history. There is something quietly haunting about abandoned infrastructure. A road leading nowhere. A staircase ending beneath trees. An aqueduct still carrying water centuries after its builders vanished. It creates the impression not merely of ruins, but of interrupted intention. Some researchers have wondered whether volcanic activity may have influenced Guayabo's fate. The settlement lies near volcanic terrain, where earthquakes and environmental instability shaped life for generations. Others point toward shifting regional dynamics, competition, migration, or changing economic networks that altered patterns of settlement. These explanations remain plausible, but uncertainty leaves space for imagination. And Guayabo, perhaps more than many sites, seems to invite it. Among alternative interpretations, some have suggested that Guayabo's layout reflects astronomical or ceremonial alignments not yet fully understood. Certain pathways and structural orientations appear deliberate, though establishing precise celestial significance remains difficult. Ancient societies across the Americas often observed solar and seasonal cycles with remarkable attention. Architecture and astronomy were frequently intertwined. Could Guayabo preserve similar relationships? Some scholars believe ceremonial symbolism likely influenced planning. Others urge caution, noting that patterns can emerge naturally within organized settlements without requiring hidden astronomical codes. Still, the possibility lingers, particularly when one considers the enigmatic stone features scattered throughout the site. Large carved stones bearing spirals and petroglyphs appear among the ruins. Their meanings remain uncertain. Spirals, animal imagery, and abstract symbols recur throughout ancient Costa Rican art, often associated with cosmology, status, or spiritual belief. But meaning fades when context disappears. A symbol once immediately understood may become unreadable centuries later, and perhaps that is part of Guayabo's enduring power. It resists complete translation. There are also more speculative theories, ideas existing outside archaeological consensus. Some writers have proposed that Guayabo formed part of a forgotten network of ancient knowledge, linking distant cultures through trade, navigation, or sacred geography. Others describe the site as a place of unusual energy or spiritual resonance, citing the constant flow of water and the atmosphere of the surrounding forest. These interpretations remain difficult to verify. Yet they persist, perhaps because Guayabo feels strangely alive compared to many ruins. The water still moves. Birdsong fills the trees. Mist settles over ancient foundations as though the city has never entirely surrendered itself to the past. Perhaps that sensation reveals more about human perception than hidden forces, or perhaps certain places preserve memory in subtler ways. Excavations at Guayabo remain incomplete. Large portions of the settlement are still concealed beneath dense vegetation and untouched soil. Archaeologists continue uncovering new features, expanding the known boundaries of the site and challenging earlier assumptions. What lies beneath the forest remains uncertain. More roads? Ceremonial structures? Entire neighborhoods still hidden beneath centuries of growth? As clouds gather over the volcanic slopes and rain begins once more to move through Guayabo's ancient channels, the silence of the settlement feels less empty than expectant. The city survives not through towering monuments or written chronicles, but through absence, through questions carried by water and stone. And somewhere beneath the jungle floor, beneath roots and drifting mist, perhaps the deeper story of Guayabo still waits, asking a question that remains unanswered. Was this place merely abandoned by history, or is history still uncovering what Guayabo was truly meant to be?